And now, from our 1999 American President's Life Portrait series, we feature President George H.W. Bush. This program is about 3 hours.
In economics. At 24, he moved west to learn the oil business, eventually settling in Midland, Texas, where he founded an oil development company in 1950. Other ventures followed, and by the middle of the decade, he had emerged as a successful businessman. Meanwhile, he'd started a family. A son, George W., was born in 1946, followed by a daughter, Robin, who died at age 3 of leukemia. The Bushes would eventually have 3 more sons, Jeb, Neil, and Marvin, and another daughter, Dorothy. He launched his political career in the 1960s. Bush lost a Senate bid in 1964, but 2 years later won a seat in the House, where he represented Houston for 2 terms. He lost another Senate race in 1970, but the next year was appointed UN ambassador by President Nixon, who later tapped him to serve as chairman of the Republican National Committee, a post he filled during the Watergate years. Later, Bush served as emissary to mainland China, and after that, as head of the CIA. He ran for president in 1980, losing his party's nomination but gaining a spot on the ticket as Ronald Reagan's running mate. He went on to serve as Reagan's vice president for 8 years. He sought the presidency again in 1988, and this time he won, becoming the first incumbent vice president to win the office since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Bush brought a low-key style to the White House. He spoke off the cuff to reporters, often in a trademark style free of first-person pronouns, and worked to build personal friendships with world leaders. George is not John Wayne, said advisor Roger Ailes. He's more like Gary Cooper in High Noon. He's very gentle. He would much rather talk than fight. But when Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, Bush intervened, organizing a coalition of nations to launch a military offensive the following January. The month-long conflict in the Persian Gulf helped secure him an approval rating of 89%, the highest in the history of the Gallup poll. By the fall of 1992, however, the number had dropped, and Bush lost his bid for re-election to Democrat Bill Clinton. He retired to Texas and Kennebunkport, where as a grandfather of 14, he continues to enjoy his role as family patriarch. In recent years, he's watched his son Jeb become governor of Florida, and his eldest, George W., be re-elected governor of Texas, as well as emerge as a leading presidential contender. Active in retirement, he celebrated his 75th birthday in 1999 by skydiving over his presidential library in College Station, Texas. He's also co-authored a book on world events during his presidency and in October of 1999 published a volume of letters written over the course of his life titled All the Best, George Bush.
Good evening from College Station, Texas, and the George Bush Presidential Library. David Alsterbrook, who is the director of the library here on the Texas A&M campus, is here to tell us about the life and times of George Bush. As we walk inside the Presidential Library, tell me about this facility. What do you have here?
Well, most presidential libraries are not really libraries in the traditional sense with books. We are an archive that contains documents from George Bush's life, his entire life, his presidency and his vice presidency. In addition to that, we are also a museum that has thousands of artifacts from his life and from Barbara's life. So those are two of the things that we do in terms of mission. In addition to that, we're also an educational outreach facility. And so we like to make sure that a lot of our visitors can see all of these wonderful treasures. And that's one of the great things about C-SPAN.
We are going to be spending the next 2.5 hours talking about the life and times of George Bush, our 41st president, as C-SPAN's American Presidents series continues. We're coming near the end of this, began it in March. And as we get closer to the presidents that you know well, we hope you'll join in with our recording and understanding of contemporary history. Our telephone lines will be open throughout our program for your participation. 202-624-1111 if you live in the eastern half of the U.S. and 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. David Alsterbrook will be our host here at the library. We're also going to be talking to John Robert Green, who is on our set, which is located in another portion of the library. He's just published a book about George Bush. As we go back to the library in its founding, when did you open?
It was opened in November of 1997. The dedication was held that day on this site.
And tell me about the day and what it was like.
Well, it was a wonderful day. We had over 20,000 people who visited that particular day. We had all of the former presidents, with the exception of Ronald Reagan, and Mrs. Reagan was here. We had all the former first ladies. In addition to that, President and Mrs. Clinton were here, and then hundreds and thousands of the friends of George and Barbara Bush. Their families were here as well. So it was just a wonderful day.
As we stand in the rotunda, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but one of the first things I noticed is this very large portrait from a time many of us remember well. It says right away it's from the Persian Gulf War. Can you tell us about it?
Harlan Crow, who's a member of our Board of Trustees, was instrumental in donating this Mark Bauman painting. From left to right, of course, you can see some of the major players in Operation Desert Storm. From left to right, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, Secretary of State Baker, President Bush, General Scowcroft, who's the National Security Council advisor to the President, and then, of course, General Colin Powell. But it is a very large painting. It weighs several hundred pounds. We had to build a special ramp for it to rest on when we moved it into the museum.
How long have you known George Bush?
I guess I first met him around 8 or 9 years ago.
And how did you come to run this library for him?
Well, that's sort of a long story, and I'll give you the short version of it. I'm a career civil servant with the National Archives and Records Administration, which runs 10 of the presidential libraries. I spent 10 years at the Carter Library in Atlanta. I went back to Washington in the summer of '91 to work on Bush presidential records. And in so doing, at the end of the administration, I had a chance to come down here, help move all the Bush records down, and then 2 years ago, I was named director of the library.
Joining us, we're going to try to connect once again with Bob Green, John Robert Green, whose new book, The Presidency of George Bush, has just come out from the University of Press of Kansas. Bob Green, can you tell us a bit about why this presidency is significant?
It's significant because the presidency itself is one of the most influential in foreign policy of the modern era, not just for the Persian Gulf War, but for the role that it played in the balancing in Europe and in the Middle East. And it's also significant because George Bush's approach to the presidency was so different from that of his immediate predecessors as to make him almost unique in the annals of the modern presidency.
What do you mean by that?
Bush was a very cautious individual, a person who approached the presidency in a manner that was unlike the manner that preceded him, particularly Ronald Reagan. He was an engaged president, to be sure, but he was not a person to make decisions rashly or to allow his staff to do that. And that's part of the success and part of what fueled the fires of criticism of his presidency as well.
How did he develop his leadership style? Was he a student of the presidency before he took the office?
Well, he wasn't so much a student of the presidency as he was a student of presidential style. He came up through the ranks, and you'll see this as you walk through the museum, with the best background of a president of the modern period, both executive and legislative. And that really made him a very, very special type of person in the Oval Office in terms of the background that he had.
I'm going to start walking through the rotunda of the library here, and as we do, David Alsterbrook and Bob Green and myself will be listening to the first telephone call of the evening. It's from Brooklyn.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Greg Chernak. I'd like to say how much I'd enjoyed this series. I'm also happy to say I'm going to be visiting the library in about 2 weeks.
What will bring you here?
I'm going to be traveling with my girlfriend throughout Louisiana and over to Houston. We're going to go up to the library on our way back. She's from Shreveport. So
what interests you in George Bush's presidency?
Well, it was just an interesting time. We like going to visit presidential sites and presidential libraries, so we're looking forward to stopping in. My question? I'm sorry.
Go ahead with your question.
My question's about the 1980 campaign. I was only 9 years old at the time, so I don't remember that much about it. And I was wondering how a man who had only served 2 terms in Congress, while it had a number of appointed positions, really hadn't been very involved in holding a lot of elected positions, was able to become the primary challenge for Ronald Reagan, was able to win the Iowa caucuses, and then was able to become the vice presidential nominee. What was the secret to his success?
Bob Green.
Bush's secret to success in 1980 was, for starters, only temporary, because by the time the later campaign or the later primaries had wound down, Reagan had pretty much blown all the challengers out of the water. But in terms of his success in the early part, as you say, the Iowa campaign, it was fundraising to a certain extent, the role that Bob Mosbacher and James Baker played in the campaign, and it was also Bush's connection with the Iowa people. Bush had been preparing for this for a number of years, and he was very well prepared going into the 1980 campaign. But he ran out of steam and money after Iowa and the New Hampshire victory of Ronald Reagan, and he moved into the vice presidential slot.
It's interesting to note that as we're visiting the library tonight, George Bush's eldest son is engaged in a debate seeking the presidential nomination himself. What is it about this family and its interest in politics? Is it something that they have worked actively through the generations?
I'm not sure that they've worked actively with it, Susan, but certain people are already talking about the Republican Kennedys, the fact that there is a dynasty developing here. I'm not certain that anything like that is something that is planned as much as it happens because of the skill of the people involved, the skill of George W. and Jeb Bush, as well as the fact that both young men had an opportunity to watch the development of their father as an executive, not just in the White House, but throughout his years of preparation through the federal government. It's a remarkable learning curve for 2 young people who want to get into politics.
We've got some phone lines open in all parts of the United States if you'd like to be involved. Let me give you those numbers one more time. 202-624-1111 if you live in the eastern half of the U.S. and 202-624-1115 for those who live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones. I'm going to ask David Alsterbrook. We've picked a few things out that caught our eye, but along the way, if there's things that you think our viewers really should see, let's stop and learn more about it. We're right now at a special exhibit about the president and the press.
Right. This is a temporary exhibit that we have here on the history of the White House press office, the press secretary, and it's focused primarily on the period since the early 20th century. Marlin Fitzwater, who was press secretary to both Presidents Reagan and Bush, is featured in this exhibit. And behind you, Susan, you'll notice that Mr. Fitzwater very generously loaned us a jacket from that period, as well as one of his favorite hats. He has a large hat collection, and we've been working very closely with Marlin Fitzwater to see if he will donate that entire collection to the library at some point. We're not quite there yet, but someday we will be there.
Throughout the program, you will be seeing clips of an interview we taped just a few weeks ago with President Bush here in Texas, and also archival footage that will bring you back to certain points along his career and of the presidency we knew so well from the late 80s and early 90s. Let me show one of those clips right now. It has to do with President Bush talking about the news media during one instance in his career.
Because I didn't write the editors, I didn't write the publishers when I was president. I wrote one letter to Punch Sulzberger when I thought, smeared by an ugly story about being disconnected because of the scanner. I never knew what a scanner was. And what we had done is seen brand new technology, and most of the other media people reported it that way.
In the grocery store.
Yeah, but the one, no, it was in a convention, unveiling new machinery, how you could take a crushed package for the first time in history and show the price tag on that package. And I said, this is amazing. So some lazy little reporter for the New York Times sat in his office, wasn't even there, and wrote, there he is, he's out of touch. He doesn't know you can scan groceries. And the damn story lived on. Even though a CBS guy said this is unfair, even though somebody, you know, everybody else, most everybody else jumped on the guy that wrote the story. But it's still there, caught up in one of your big computers somewhere. And I saw a favorable story about me in the Wall Street Journal this year. Hell, I'm out of it. And it referred to the, well, it's too bad he wasn't connected, and his scanner thing showed that.
Bob Greene, what does that conversation, reflecting back on that incident so many years ago, say about George Bush and his view of the press?
All the way through Bush's presidency, the press and Bush had a relationship. When I asked Bush, did you hate the press during your presidency, he smiled and he said, well, not the whole time. Bush, I think, had a relationship that was born out of the rancor of the 1988 campaign and the wimp factor, the Dan Rather press appearance, the Willie Horton advertisement that carried into the Bush presidency. And while he tried to mediate it with more access, he gave more press conferences in 1 year than Reagan had, I believe, in 6. Bush still believed, and I think there's evidence to support this, that the press was antagonistic towards him through to and into the 1992 campaign. I would say from what Bush says in this clip, even about the scanner story, he has more than a case.
Springfield, New Jersey.
Hi, my name is Alex Kramers. I wanted to know, is there anything that Mr. Bush regretted that he didn't accomplish during his presidency?
Mr. Alsterbrook, has he ever told you anything he regretted not accomplishing?
No, and I really haven't had an occasion to actually discuss that particular topic with him, and but no, he's never told me anything like that.
How about Bob Greene? He only had a chance at one term. Was there any regrets that he didn't get to some of his agenda?
I met with him once for my book, and I got the impression from him, although he didn't say this to me deliberately, that he regretted absolutely nothing, that he wouldn't change a thing.
Lafayette, Indiana, you're next as we discuss George Bush.
My question revolves around the Persian Gulf War, about the building of the coalition. I was wondering how hard that was to arrange and how difficult it was to keep together.
Bob Greene?
It was the diplomatic masterstroke of the post-World War II period. The key to the coalition was keeping the Russians, the Soviet Union, in the coalition while Gorbachev's empire was crumbling, and keeping the Israelis from ruining the coalition by mounting a counterattack against Iraqi Scud missiles. These two things Bush was able to accomplish, and it's become a cliche that George Bush was a successful foreign policy president. But what the caller just brings out, the coalition, Bush's term for it, the New World Order, was indeed the most important and influential part of his presidency, a complete success.
Well, one of our next stops is going to be looking at some of the roots of his policy development in the Cold War. Can you talk us through the importance of him having grown up in the Cold War and actually fought during World War II on his later presidential policies?
George Bush, like the presidents of the immediate period following World War II, World War II is the seminal, most important event shaping his character and his policies. His view of many people, when it got to the Persian Gulf War, for example, he personalized the conflict with Saddam Hussein into a good versus evil conflict. But yet he embraced Mikhail Gorbachev far beyond the point where many members of his staff felt that it was worthwhile. To George Bush, his view of the world and the Cold War view shaped his foreign policy.
Good time to pick up and talk about his relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev. Where are we? Well,
we're in a temporary exhibit, which we have here, called The Longest Winter, Berlin, and it deals with the history of the Cold War since 1945. We're at the very end of this particular exhibit. I'd like to show you one item in particular. It's this map. This was given to President Bush when he met with Mikhail Gorbachev aboard the Gorky back in 1989. The interesting thing about this map is that it has all of the locations of the American nuclear weaponry throughout much of the world. It was prepared by the Soviet Union, and it was presented to George Bush as a symbol of friendship between our two nations. And I think the fact that Mikhail Gorbachev gave this map to President Bush tells you an awful lot about the relationship between these two men. This particular map is not part of our collection yet. This particular map was loaned to us by President Bush, and he proudly keeps it normally in his office in Houston, but he very graciously loaned the map to us for this temporary exhibit on the Cold War.
1989, certainly an eventful year in the history of the world with the end of many of the Cold War countries, and we'll look at some of those pictures on the walls around us as we listen to a caller from Milwaukee. We're on the air.
Good evening. I was wondering if Mr. Green could comment upon the selection of Dan Quayle as Vice President. And personally, I like Dan Quayle, and I certainly miss George Bush as president, but what would have happened, say, if Bush replaced him in '92, and was that even a viable option? Thank you.
Two questions there. The choice for Dan Quayle in 1988 was an absolutely inspired choice. What's been missed about Dan Quayle is that he filled in gaps that George Bush sorely needed to have filled in. He filled in the youth, the Midwestern vote. He filled in the far conservative vote that Bush was in danger of losing in 1988, another point that's forgotten. But then, and you're seeing the announcement here of Dan Quayle as vice president, when he was announced, Quayle immediately got into the spotlight more than Bush's advisors wanted because of a poor vetting process. Many of Bush's own personal advisors didn't know about Dan Quayle's personal background. The problems with Paula Parkinson, the problems with his military background, and he immediately became the story. And throughout Bush's presidency, as we all know, Dan Quayle was treated as a liability by many people in the office, in the Oval Office, and yes, it was considered to drop Dan Quayle in 1992, but George Bush would have none of it.
How much of the Quayle vice presidency do you have displayed here?
Well, we have a few objects and documents that are actually part of the Quayle collection. Our primary job here, though, is to preserve and make available under the Presidential Records Act the Dan Quayle Vice Presidential Records. Dan Quayle has a museum in Huntington, Indiana, where some of his objects are displayed. But here, as part of the National Archives, one of our jobs is to make sure that the Quayle Vice Presidential Records are readily accessible under the Freedom of Information Act, which is part of the Presidential Records Act. So we've got virtually all of his official vice presidential records in this building.
This is a good time to introduce you to another person who will be with us throughout our program, Warren Finch, who is in what part of the building right now?
He's up in our main stack level where we keep most of our unclassified records. And so in this area you will find Bush official presidential records, you'll find Bush vice presidential records, you'll also find Dan Quayle vice presidential records.
Mr. Finch, thank you for, I understand that you're going to be listening to calls and throughout the night showing us some interesting documents from the presidency. Before we see our first, which have to do with the Cold War, explain how it all works. What papers are open from a presidency that's so recent?
Well, we get these papers are all governed by the Presidential Records Act. So we have researchers that file Freedom of Information Act request, and we've had a recent Freedom of Information Act request on Bush-Cole correspondence. So one of the documents I have here is a memo of conversation between President Bush and President Cole, which talks about the students, the young people that are beginning to come across from East Germany to West Germany, and Chancellor Cole is concerned about the large number of people that are coming across the border and the instability that it might cause in East Germany.
Again, how does it work? Are President's papers considered the property of the people of the United States?
Right. There had been a custom of private ownership of President's papers, so all the presidential documents for Presidents Washington through Carter were the personal property of the President, and they could do with them whatever they want. There's been a custom since President Roosevelt to deposit those papers in a presidential library. Beginning with the Reagan administration, though, the law was changed that end that private ownership of presidential records, and they're now federal records. So Reagan presidential documents and Bush presidential documents are governed by an act called the Presidential Records Act, which governs the access to the records and how they're reviewed and made available to the public.
And when will they all be open? What's the timeline?
Oh, we'll be here a long time. In my lifetime, and probably the archivists that come after me, we've got about 10%, maybe 12% of the collection open now. For the most part, we're opening things under the Freedom of Information Act. Because our records are federal records, they're all subject to the FOIA. And so we receive FOIAs from researchers, and as we receive those FOIAs, we do a first come, first serve, so first in, first out review. And we've opened materials on the Persian Gulf War, Pan Am 103. These documents were recently released on the Cole-Bush conversations. Somalia, it just depends on what the researchers are interested in.
Can you say overall who spends more time here, historians writing books or contemporary reporters still trying to piece together history?
For the most part, historians and students working on master's degrees and dissertations they're our main clients right now.
Bloomington, Illinois, you're next on George Bush.
Yes, I was a sailor during the Persian Gulf War. And first of all, I'd like to compliment Mr. Finch, Mr. Alsobrook, on what looks like a very thorough library. It looks like you've done a great job there. My question is, the President was a fighter pilot in World War II, and the next time we see him in the military, he's the Commander-in-Chief. Are there, is there any other military experience or involvement that he had in between World War II and the Persian Gulf War? This is just a piece of history I'm interested in.
Thanks, Bob Green. We're going to talk about that in more detail, but how about a quick answer for him?
The quick answer is that the experience that he spent in Congress on specific committees and the experience that he spent at the CIA gave him a great deal of military experience prior to becoming Commander-in-Chief.
Edison, New Jersey, you're next.
Hi, this is Rena Steinbach, and I was just wondering, what was Bush's greatest accomplishment as president?
Well, thanks very much. Would you like to take that, Mr. Alsobrook?
Well, I think this is something that we will continue to talk about for many, many years to come, and Bob Green has already touched on some of the details of this. I think one of his greatest accomplishments as president was building the coalition prior to Operation Desert Storm. I think the fact that he was able to keep all those nations together was a miraculous accomplishment, and I think that's one of the things that future generations around the world will remember.
Let's walk again, but as we do, listen to Citrus Heights, California. You're on the air. Citrus Heights, go ahead.
Hello.
All right.
I was wondering, in the '92 campaign, that the perceptions of him were not absolutely backwards. People thought he was cool and out of touch, and I think that he's a warm and fuzzy kind of guy. He's close to all his family and plays with toddler children, and grandchildren rather. And I'm just wondering if in the '92 campaign he lacked the killer instinct or the cold-bloodedness to really battle Clinton. So what do you think?
Bob Green.
Either he lacked it or his staff simply did not have the killer instinct as well. He had lost several of the people, Lee Atwater, Roger Ailes, who had helped him in the 1988 campaign. George Bush resists being handled. It's a great strength as a personal individual, but as 1992 showed, it was a weakness as a politician. I think the caller has it right. The roles were reversed, and the public didn't really get an opportunity to see George Bush as he really was. And I tend to fault the campaign staff in 1992, as well as Bush, who was tired, possibly ill. It was a campaign that really misrepresented George Bush in a lot of ways.
You mentioned two names. Tell us a little bit more about Lee Atwater. Roger Ailes, we know now, as the head of Fox. Who was Lee Atwater?
Lee Atwater ran George Bush's campaign in 1988. He had worked his way through politics in South Carolina. Atwater was, by his own admission, a street fighter, a combat kid, almost gang warfare in politics. He was the perfect antithesis to George Bush's almost malleable personality. He was the hard act, and so was Roger Ailes, who worked with Bush on advertising in 1988. I mean, Lee Atwater was a take-no-prisoners type of person. This was what George Bush needed in 1988 to combat what we may remember was called the wimp factor. And in several instances, Lee Atwater put that right to bed in 1988. He died just before the 1992 campaign, and the campaign sorely missed his hard edge.
Summit, New Jersey. Good evening.
Hi, I'm Lori Sherman from Summit, New Jersey. My question is, what were Bush's ambitions as a young child, and did he have any far-reach goals or dreams that he wanted to pursue?
Well, thanks, and you've asked that question at just the right time, because we are right in front of the part of the exhibit here that talks about his young family life.
Yes, we are. As a matter of fact, going back to a couple of callers ago, I wanted to thank him for the comments about the museum, but I want to give full credit to President and Mrs. Bush for all the assistance they gave us in designing this museum. This is the portion of the museum which deals with the Bush and Pierce families and the Walker families. And this is essentially the way President and Mrs. Bush wanted us to present the story of their early lives. So here you primarily have black and white photographs of their parents, grandparents, and their other relatives.
Okay, who is his father?
His father was Prescott Bush Sr., and this is a bust of his father.
And what did his father do?
His father was primarily involved in investment banking on Wall Street and other places. The interesting thing about Prescott is that he preceded his son at Yale. He was a tremendous athlete at Yale. He also served in the First World War. And the thing that I really want to stress, getting back to this caller's question, George Bush's parents really instilled in him a sense of duty, honor, country, and the fact that we all owe something back to our nation. And I think this was one of the attributes of his upbringing, which was so important to his later service to our nation.
Biographer Bob Greene, add some more details for us, please, about Prescott Bush, about his mother, and how many siblings George Bush had.
Well, Bush came from a very large family. In fact, his relationship with his brothers is one of the most interesting stories that I think is told in Bush's early life. The caller asked about Bush's aspirations. One of the things that Bush showed immediately was a desire not to follow in his father's footsteps. His father did not want him to go into the military service, counseled him against it, and Bush did. His father counseled him against wildcatting for oil in Texas, and Bush did. And yet it's his father, Prescott, who instills this independent streak in George Bush. I think the other thing that needs to be remembered about this background with these pictures that you're seeing is that later on in Bush's political career, his opponents would use that family background to charge him with the elitist tag, that Bush was just too yuppie, too New England, too rich, too preppy to be in touch with the American people. And that's a charge that Bush battled all the way through his political career, right through to the 1992 election. So his family life cut a double-edged sword in terms of politics.
His father was an elective office.
His father was a senator from Connecticut. He was appointed senator after the death of Brian McMahon and served, I believe, 2 terms as Senate. Bush was in Texas at the time of Prescott Bush's service in the Senate, so he has said on several occasions that he wasn't as plugged into that part of his father's career as he was the earlier portion when Prescott was on Wall Street.
Next call, as we talk about George Bush, is from Boston.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to know how long he was in China and his experience in China shaped his China policy when he was president.
Are you of Chinese descent or background yourself?
That's right. I'm a student here.
You're a student here. And can you tell us what the impression of George Bush is in your homeland?
Pardon me?
Can you tell us what the impression of George Bush is in China?
I think it's 1 year, right?
I'm sorry?
I think he was in China for 1 year.
Yes, but what do people think of him there?
Well, I think most Chinese regard him as a friend. I think he probably knows the Chinese society better than most Americans.
Bob Green, what took him to China?
President Ford asked him to go to China, and he wasn't he was an ambassador, but not an ambassador. We didn't have full diplomatic relations with China at the time. In terms of affecting foreign policy at the time, everything was funneled through Henry Kissinger, and so Ford was not Bush was not a policy maker. He has said on several occasions that he learned a great deal about the Chinese and the Chinese language, but like everything else in Bush's career, this was almost like an advanced placement course in diplomacy that would come back to help him in later years. Bush had the first-hand experience with China that allowed him to react as he did to the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, and that may have played out much differently with a president who had not been in China, known the Chinese people.
Next telephone call is from Everett, Washington.
Thank you. As a World War II veteran, I'm sort of a history buff, and I'd like to have the accuracy. George Bush was not a fighter pilot. He was a pilot of a torpedo bomber, and the name of that was Avenger. And I also like to point out that the National Guard in the Second World War was one of those divisions of the two, including the Army's 1st Division, that hit the beach at Normandy. And I would also like to state that we should have the truth. It isn't like Mr. Green mentioned. George Bush's past history is misrepresented. It's not misrepresented. It is true, out-and-out lies. So we want accuracy where accuracy is factual. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the call. Well, right over our heads here is a model. It's not a model, it's an actual plane of the type that George Bush flew. Why don't you talk to the rest of the audience who doesn't know it as intimately as this caller did?
Well, you're exactly right, Susan. This is a TBM. This is an Avenger, torpedo bomber. It was nicknamed the Pregnant Turkey by some of the men who flew this airplane. This is identical to the airplane that George Bush was shot down near Chichijima in the South Pacific in the Bonin Island chain in September of 1944. This airplane was donated to the library by Jack Guy, a gentleman in Atlanta who actually flew with George Bush in his squadron. So this is the exact type of airplane that George Bush piloted during the Second World War.
Bob Green, you've got some statistics in your book, and I want you to hold your book up so our audience can see what it looks like. We can sell you a few copies tonight because it's right off the presses just last week. But tell us some statistics about how many bombing runs, how many missions George Bush flew in World War II.
George Bush flew it without remembering the exact statistics. It's amazing what you can forget after you've written it and put it in a book. George Bush flew more than the amount of missions than he was required to, and when he earned leave, in fact, he had earned enough points to be rotated out. after he had been shot down, he decided to re-up. So I'm going to dodge that question in terms of the specific statistics and share with our callers the fact that Bush and the people who served in World War II, David mentioned a moment ago, honor and duty. This was not something that was avoided. In fact, it was something that was so much a part of their character and a part of their being that even when many of them had long since gone past the time that they had served their country well, they were willing to re-up, and Bush would have done so had not his re-enlistment come so close to the end of the war with the atomic bomb.
Our next call for our guests from the George Bush Library in College Station, Texas is from Hyattsville, Maryland.
Yes, good evening. My name is Arnold. I am particularly astonished by a special segment of Mr. Bush's career as head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I'm sure that that remains one of the fine wonders of this world among various political and military functionaries to this time. Do you care to comment on the well-crafted strategy to covertly establish and redefine American political and military power globally, while concurrently exhibiting an overt international relations perspective fashioned to camouflage the real objective and intent to secure America's superpower requirement? I recognize that as a military commissioned officer as being one of the principal tasks that Mr. Bush has carried out very excellently. I would certainly be grateful for your views on that.
Bob Green?
In terms of Bush's service at the Central Intelligence Agency, he came in at a time when the CIA was under fire. It had just gone through a series of investigations up on Capitol Hill, the Church Committee, the Rockefeller Committee under President Ford, and Bush was brought in to calm very, very troubled waters. He wasn't there for all that long. He was there for about a year, and President Carter, to Bush's chagrin, refused to show that the office of DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, was bipartisan and did not ask Bush to stay on. But virtually everyone who has commented on Bush's time at the Central Intelligence Agency has talked about Bush's fairness and about his ability to put back into the agency a great deal of the spirit that had been lost through the Watergate Vietnam period.
Let's pause for a minute and give some people's perspective. First of all, internally, you and I can hear Bob Green's voice because he's just 2 rooms over from us. How many square feet do you have here?
Oh, in this particular part of the building, we've probably got about 16,000 square feet here.
And how much of the campus overall do you have here?
Well, we've got about 90 acres of this west campus at Texas A&M University.
Tell us the story of how you came here.
Well, that's a long story, and once again, I'll try to give you the short version of that story. President Bush made the decision that this is where he wanted his Presidential Library and Museum to be. I think there were a lot of personal reasons why he made that decision, but I think first and foremost he wanted to be involved with students. He wanted to spend time in the classroom with students. He wanted his library to be an integral part of an academic environment. And I think that was the prime reason that he picked Texas A&M, because their proposal included a George Bush School of Government and Public Service, which is just next door to this library building. So I think that was one of the reasons that went into it.
And if you're trying to make connections, this is in fact the campus that you sadly have been reading about over the past month, which was the site of the bonfire that turned into a tragedy for the students here in their annual football game against Texas. It's just a few blocks away from here.
Yes, it really is. It's only a few blocks from here, and it's been a very tough past few weeks for Aggies and the Aggie family, I can assure you of that.
What's an Aggie?
An Aggie is essentially somebody who either graduated from Texas A&M or who feels very close to Texas A&M. I think again, I'm not an Aggie, so I may be speaking out of turn here, but I think it refers to the fact that back in the 19th century, during the formative years of this great university, a lot of the people who studied here came from agricultural backgrounds and studied ag here, so the term Aggie.
We're learning about George Bush's life, our 41st president, the 40th man to serve in that office. Grover Cleveland had 2 terms, but they were not concurrent, so that's how the numbering system confuses everybody as we pursue our 41 presidents, 42 presidencies this year. Abbeville, South Carolina, you're next.
Yes, this is a great series of programs. I want to thank you for mentioning Lee Atwater. We're very proud of him here in South Carolina. George Bush, as president, inherited something from Ronald Reagan that was one of the most difficult things that a president ever had to do. He bailed out the savings and loan industry. Maybe it had to be done, maybe it did not. However, I wanted to ask Professor Green how he thinks President Bush will rank down through history with the great one-term presidents. My favorite is Jimmy Carter. One of the great one-term presidents was James K. Polk, who set up the independent federal treasury, which we still have today. James Polk was from North Carolina, a graduate of the University of North Carolina, which we're proud of in our area. So I'll just ask that general question from Professor Green, how he thinks President Bush will rank down through history as a one-term president. I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
That will probably be one of the most difficult calls that we get all night, because the caller is asking something that historians are loath to do, and that's paint a legacy on a person who has so recently been in power. But in terms of the one term, certainly one point is that you shouldn't worry about and should not base a judgment on a president as to whether or not they're reelected. As the caller points out, Polk, Carter, and many others served just one term and should be rated in the great or near great category. Certainly from my point of view right now, George Bush is at least in the near great category. There were successes and there were notable failures in the Bush administration, and there were things that were handled with more elan and more panache than were other issues. But I think in terms of the overall, and David has alluded to it earlier tonight, George Bush is going to be seen as at least a success as president.
Palusa, California, you're next.
Yeah, hi, my name is Chuck, and I'm a big fan of the American President series, and I'm also a big fan of President Bush, and I have a question for Mr. Green. I'd like to know why, given the fact that you know, George Bush's his involvement in World War II, and the fact of the brilliant victory in the Persian Gulf, and the fact I'm not sure why the media has always labeled him as a wimp, but I would like to know how he lost the election, and if you could comment on that, and did the media have a significant role in that? I'll hang up for your answer. Thanks.
The wimp factor, the elitist factor, as I mentioned a while back, has followed George Bush around since the beginning of his career, and it's deeply rooted in national perceptions of the type of upbringing that he had in New England, and the fact that he was well-to-do. And yet you see a man pulling himself up by his own bootstraps in Texas, taking incredible chances with both his life and his career there, moving into areas of the federal government where his background may have been wanting, but his spirit never was. And you get into the 1992 campaign, and it seems that America is simply judging him on this regard. I still feel very strongly that it was the fault of Bush's campaign staff not getting the message out front, perhaps Bush himself, in terms of not meeting to the challenges of both candidate Clinton and candidate Ross Perot, let us not forget, who were hammering on Bush's character, and that issue has hurt him, and we've only really begun to reevaluate that.
As David Alsorbrook and I continue to stand under the Avenger, the plane that George Bush flew in World War II, let's return to the archives where Warren Finch has some documents from World War II.
I have a letter here that George Bush wrote home to his mom and dad, telling them that he'd finished flying combat missions and he was headed home, and he had written a letter to Barbara, but that just in case Barbara didn't get his letter, he told his mom to give her a call and tell her it was okay to go ahead and set the date for the wedding. And then he asked his mom for a little help on making arrangements for the honeymoon. And we have this letter here. In addition, there are two letters on display in the museum. One letter he wrote to his mom and dad right after he was shot down, talking about losing his two crewmen. And then he wrote a second letter talking about life on a submarine and how different it was from flying off a carrier.
Can you read us a sentence or two?
Sure. It says, this is a letter that I've wanted to write you for a long time. At long last, I can tell you that we're coming home. I'm all through flying, combat complete, off the ship, and ready for a nice long leave. After you get this letter, it'll still be quite a while before I reach the States and can call you up. But nevertheless, I'm pretty darn happy. I wrote Barb and said, I'm sorry, please call Barb in case she doesn't get this letter. And his mother goes on to say, to tell Barbara that she can set a date for the wedding.
The former president has a book, it's a collection of letters he's written over the years. It's already on the bestseller list. Did he come here and do the research?
Actually, he spent a lot of time here, as a matter of fact, over the last couple of years. He was here as recently as last week. Jean Becker, his chief of staff, did a lot of the on-site research here, and we pulled the letters for her to examine. But it's my understanding from talking with Gene that he looked at virtually every one of these letters, and as you pointed out, that book has been out a couple of months now, and it's been on the bestseller list. It's a great book.
Bob Green, about George Bush as a letter writer, I heard someone observe a few years back that they thought that George Bush corresponded his way into the White House because he learned early on the value of sending a little note off from the earliest part of public life. Can you talk about that?
One of Bush's close aides told me that he saw the world as one big Rolodex. Bush's correspondence comes from his genteel upbringing, his mother's demanding that he needed to write a thank you note for every event, and Bush is an inveterate letter writer. One of his campaign aides in his book said that he had to tell his wife to stop writing thank you notes for Bush's thank you notes, or the correspondence would just simply go on forever. And it's part of the charm, but it's also part of the political connection as well. To get a personal note from someone when you're considering that possibly voting for him in a convention, that carries an awful lot of weight, and Bush knew that, and these notes have gone down in absolute legend. When you find them here in the library, in the papers, the Xerox copies of Bush's personal notes, they're both the most charming and the most telling documents that I looked at while I was here.
Let's take a call from Ewing, New Jersey.
Good evening. I'd like to first congratulate C-SPAN for its work in general and the series in particular, and also for the work that you people in the Texas A&M University have done on this library. And now I have a question from 1991. After the Persian Gulf War, Bush twice went before a joint session of Congress to talk about the war and his plans for the future, and it included an old Republican standby, a reduction in the capital gains tax. But in one of those speeches, he stopped and then stated that he understood the opposition and was therefore proposing the establishment of a blue ribbon panel to assess whether the capital gains tax reduction would do what its supporters claimed it would. The thing is, after he made that proposal, nobody ever mentioned what happened to that proposal. There was none of the opponents talked about it. He didn't talk about it. The reporters didn't talk about it. What happened to the panel? That's my question.
Bob Green.
I don't know. I remember the line from the speech, but I would be less than honest if I said that I knew what happened to that panel, if indeed it was formed.
Before we leave this section of the library, we referred to her a few times, but this is where we first meet in this exhibit, the young Barbara Bush, as she became. How did they meet? Can you tell us the story?
Well, it's my understanding that they met at a dance back when they were both teenagers, and we've heard different versions of this story from different people, but we've heard that it was essentially love at first sight. But this photograph shows the very young Barbara Pierce. But before we leave this part of the exhibit, Susan, I did want to add that among our World War II generation visitors, this part of the exhibit is one of our most popular ones, with the torpedo bomber and the video footage showing George Bush being rescued at sea by the Finback. That's a model of the Finback, the submarine behind me. This is the USS San Jacinto, the model of the aircraft carrier that he flew off of when he flew this type of airplane. But what I've noticed, too, over the last couple of years is, in addition to our World War II generation visitors being interested in this, some of our younger visitors who don't know much about World War II have enjoyed touring this part of the museum and learning about the part that George Bush played in the war. I think this has helped them understand their parents' and grandparents' role as the so-called greatest generation, as described by Tom Brokaw.
And right behind you in this section are George and Barbara's children. Bob Green, how many children did they have?
They had, I believe, 5 children, did they not, David?
Well, I think that's correct. Robin, of course, died in 1953, and I think these photographs show all of the other children. George W., of course, Neil, and I think Marvin is in one of these as well, Doro.
And Jeb.
And Jeb, of course, the governor of Florida.
So 6 children and 5 have survived.
Right. That's correct. And the death of Robin from leukemia is one of the most important events in George Bush's life, short of World War II. Her death, which was not a particularly brief one. It lasted, her illness of leukemia lasted for quite some time. He was in Texas and had to visit her in New York. It devastated the family, and it colored the view of the Bushes towards educational issues and issues of handicapped children as well. And this happened so early on in Bush's career that it helped to shape him as a human being.
Our guests are John Robert Green, the author of a brand new biography called The Presidency of George Bush, part of the University of Kansas's Presidential History Series. Just came out last week and available in bookstores around the country. David Alsobrook, who is the director of the George Bush Library here in College Station, Texas. And you've also met Warren Finch, who is the supervisory archivist here at the library. We're going to continue walking, and as we do, listen to Springfield, New Jersey. Springfield, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Cheryl Denning, and I'm calling from Springfield. And I was just wondering if you think if George Bush's son gets elected for president, do you think that he'll be a better president than his father?
Bob Green, you want to tackle that one?
Well, there's a loaded question, but it is on the minds of an awful lot of people, and I think that it's a very fair question. Why should he not be judged, George W., up against his father any more than Bobby Kennedy was judged up against his brother, for example? I don't know whether George W. Bush will be a better president than George Bush. I don't know whether he will even be the same type of president as George Bush. We're in the middle of a campaign right now, and we're essentially seeing what the campaign, George W. Bush campaign wants us to see. We only have his record as governor of Texas to judge on. I think that what is interesting about the caller's question, though, is that people are indeed, despite what the campaign of the governor of Texas seems to wish to have happen, they are indeed judging his candidacy and his character up against his father, and that's going to be interesting to see how it plays itself out.
Kirkville, New York.
Hi, this is for Professor Green. I'd like to know about George Bush's stance on furthering environmental issues, and was he particularly proud of any accomplishments in environmental policy, or were there any regrets?
Oh, this was one of Bush's most proud accomplishments as president, was the Clean Air Act. He has, and Bush supporters have taken, I think, more credit for this than they are due. The Clean Air Act had been put into play by Senator Edmund Muskie before Bush took office. Senator George Mitchell, who was then the majority leader of the Senate, was instrumental in pushing the bill through. While Bush did give the Clean Air Act his complete support, and he is an avid outdoorsman, nothing phony about his outdoors background and his credentials as a hunter and as an outdoorsman, yet the administration took in the press virtual virtual complete credit for the Clean Air Act when in reality it had been there before, and the Senate, Democrat and Republican alike, was responsible for its passage.
Mr. Elserbrook, as Bob Greene has been handling all the political questions, you and I have been working our way through the story of George Bush's life. So far, he's just been in Connecticut.
That's correct.
So bring us to Texas.
After he graduated from Yale in 1948, he drove a Studebaker, which looked very much like the one behind us here, this particular vehicle, out to West Texas. He went to work for Dresser Industries, selling parts in the oil fields throughout Texas and on out into California as well. This part of the exhibit here deals with the West Texas years, and it attempts to capture how hard those years were for the young Bush family. And there's a photograph of George and Barbara and their children during I think the early 50s there out in West Texas.
Bob Greene, why Texas for George Bush?
It was a challenge. Bush, when he had heard about and family friends, Neil Mallon, who David reminds us worked for Dresser Industry, told Bush that there was an opening down there. Bush was raring to go. I think that, and several of Bush's biographers have pointed this out, I think that it was just simply the challenge that it offered, as Texas wildcatting did at the time, a way to make your own fortune, to carve your own niche, as you will, all the cliches that a young person really strongly feels when they are trying to break out on their own. And Texas was wide open for that at the time. It was much more of a natural draw than some of Bush's detractors have suggested.
Those of you who have been following this series along with us since March know that every week we talk to a teacher. The goal of this is to tell teachers that all of this material we have been collected, and our goal here was to put as much presidential history as has ever been recorded on television so that you could use it to teach, not just these visits to libraries and museums and presidential homes, but also throughout our Friday night part, hours and hours of videotape of historical visits and discussions with biographers, all available for you to use when you teach in the classroom. Now, we are almost at the end. We only have one more presidency to go, but that doesn't mean the material's going away. All of it continues to be available, and there will be a website that's active. And you can find all about our C-SPAN in the Classroom program. There's two ways to reach it. First of all, you can find it on the internet at www.cspan.org/classroom. Or you can talk to folks on our staff at this telephone number, 202-626-4858. That's 202-626-4858. You'll get free teaching materials, and you can use this material in your classroom from this point forward. It'll be yours to keep and use as you wish. Mention that because our teacher that we're talking to tonight has a connection with this period of George Bush's history that we're in right now. Her name is Joy O'Hara, and she's a librarian at the George Bush Elementary School in Midland, Texas. Midland, Texas being where George Bush first came to get in the oil business. Joy O'Hara, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Can you tell us what you know of your school's connection to George Bush?
Well, President and Mrs. Bush have many connections with Midland, longtime friends and colleagues and supporters. And so when it was time to name our new elementary school, President Bush's name was recommended as a way to acknowledge his accomplishments and his ties with Midland.
And when did your school open?
In 1989.
And have the President and First Lady visited?
Well, when the school was dedicated in 1989, Mrs. Bush came, and that was a wonderful experience for all of us. And then in 1995, President and Mrs. Bush were coming to Midland to see an exhibit in his honor at the Confederate Air Force Museum. And during that Midland visit, they came to our school. They did a tour of the building, and they visited briefly with each teacher. And then he spoke in our cafetorium to hundreds of students and their families.
I've never heard of a cafetorium, but it's very logical.
It's a cafeteria auditorium.
I think I had one in school, but I've never heard the word before. Now, how do you teach young people, other than those special visits by either the President or the former First Lady, how do you teach the young people about George Bush's presidency?
Well, I think at Bush Elementary, the fifth grade American history curriculum, which includes the U.S. presidents, is probably very much like it is in other schools. But overall, I think our school is more aware of current events and historical occasions than we might be if we had another name. Through the years, Bush Elementary students have had opportunities to participate in events related to the Bush family. In 1992, 15 of our students, along with 15 students from Barbara Bush Elementary, were invited to perform the flag ceremony at the opening of the Republican National Convention in Houston. And when Mrs. Bush and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison came campaigning that same year, again, students were asked to present colors. Our local high school bands have been invited both times that Texas Governor George W. Bush has been inaugurated, and they've carried a banner from our elementary schools, so we feel like we're really part of those historical events. And when the Presidential Museum, where you are tonight, was dedicated, all of Bush Elementary was watching. With Table in the Classroom, we have the opportunity to follow that event.
It sounds like your students have had some special opportunities. Without those, do you think it's possible to interest young people in history?
Oh, I think so. That's what talented teachers do. They bring current events into the classroom and make good connections for students.
You have a question for our historian, Mr. Green, Dr. Green, tonight? Anything you want to hear about George Bush's life that you don't know?
Well, what I would really like to know is, with your museum director, if there's evidence of George H.W. Bush Elementary in the exhibition.
Not in the permanent exhibit gallery. I don't think we have anything currently on exhibit, but I think we have had something in our temporary exhibit gallery in previous months. And one of the things I'd like to say to the caller too, Susan, is I would really like for you to bring your students to College Station at some point in the future so we can visit with all of y'all.
Joy O'Hara, thank you. With your conversation, we hope to inspire other teachers at the elementary, middle school, and high school level to teach about presidents. So thanks for talking to us tonight.
You're very welcome.
How many students do you get through this museum every year?
Oh, gosh, I have no earthly idea. Probably this year we're going to have close to 150,000 visitors. So we've had hundreds of students who've come through as part of that 150,000. But I might add, and the last caller reminded me of this, we're one of the few presidential libraries that has a separate classroom in this building. I don't think you have a camera in there right now, but our classroom is designed for K through 12 kids. And we try to reach out to our younger visitors through that classroom. And we teach things like the American presidency, recent U.S. history, government. And it's a fun place for our museum students who come through here to learn about those things. I have an education coordinator, Laura Spencer, who spends all of her time working in that classroom, and usually during the school year the classroom is completely booked up from the beginning till the end of the school year.
And Bob Green told me today that every once in a great while a class might get a surprise visit from a former president.
That's right. The Bushes visit a lot here in College Station. They love to go through the museum, and you just never know when you might run into either George or Barbara Bush or some member of their family.
How far away from here do they live?
Oh, from where we're standing right now? When they're in town? Or?
No, the rest of the year.
Oh, they live in Houston when they're not at Kennebunkport.
And where is Houston from where we are?
Oh, it's about 100 miles south or so from where we're standing right now.
It takes how long to drive?
Oh, it takes you probably about 90 minutes or so.
So if you want to visit this area, you can fly directly into College Station. There's a commuter flight from Houston, or you can fly to Houston and drive about an hour and a half, depending on the traffic.
That's right.
Beloit, Wisconsin, you're on the air. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. I have both a comment and a question. First of all, I'd like to say how much we've enjoyed this series. And as we've watched it, it seems that the series has developed a broad weave of American history woven into the warp of the American presidency, and that you've identified some significant works of historians and biographers well worth reading, which leads me to ask, first of all, if a complete bibliography of these works might be available to viewers at some point. And then secondly and lastly, I had a question for Mr. Green relating to the timing of the ending of Desert Storm. There seemed to be some ambivalent public reaction to that at the time. And I'm wondering, in retrospect, with the time and distance, even of short history, if concerning President Bush's decision to end at that time, if the coalition and our relations with our Middle Eastern allies would have tolerated pursuit to the toppling of Saddam. And I'll hang up so that I might enjoy your answer. Thank you.
Thank you. And as you answer that, Dr. Green, David Alsterbrook and I are going to move on to the next spot in our exhibit. So go ahead and take his question.
Well, I'll take both parts of it. The first part on the bibliography, there are several good bibliographies, but one that might serve the caller's purposes is at cspan.org. For each president, there is a separate bibliography on specific links for specific presidents. In terms of the Persian Gulf War, it's one of the most vexing questions about the Bush presidency. Why did he not move towards Baghdad? Why did he allow in quotes the Iraqis to escape up the highway of death from Basra? And the answer to it is really a very complicated one that was more complicated than I expected to find. Bush had made it very clear from the start in the Persian Gulf War that this was going to be a terminal war, not another Vietnam. But public opinion simply would not have tolerated a war that had gone on much longer. Plus, the American military was hampered by memories not just of Vietnam, but of Panama, where they experienced some difficulty in capturing one little dictator. If they moved into the streets of Baghdad, it would have been hand-to-hand combat. It would have been street combat that hadn't been seen since World War II, and the body count would have absolutely skyrocketed. And so Bush made it very clear that this was going to be a war with a finish line, and he was not about to go much past that finish line. Now, in terms of the politics of the situation, in 1992, General Schwarzkopf alluded to the fact that he did not support President Bush's decision to end the Persian Gulf War when he did, and Governor Clinton and Mr. Perot made political capital of that. The reality of the situation was much different. When the announcement came down, General Schwarzkopf not only agreed with it, but put it into play very quickly. And so it was a unanimous decision, and even more so, it seems the caller asks about long-term history in our Middle Eastern relations. There's no question but that if that war had gone on to the point where it had been street combat in Baghdad, that the coalition would have, I think the coalition would have absolutely crumbled. Israel would have been out of it like a lightning bolt, and the war would have taken an even more drastic turn than had Saddam Hussein been allowed to stay in power.
Susan, excuse me, I wanted to add something about the bibliography. I think that caller also, in part of his question, asked about the availability of a bibliography. We do have one that we generated among our staff, and if he'll just contact the Bush Library, we'll be happy to provide him with that bibliography. He can also check our website, and I think that's available someplace here.
You have the website address?
Not right off the top of my head, but Warren Finch does.
Okay, we'll get that. Folks often want to find out more about the libraries that we're visiting and the historic sites. Portland, Oregon, go ahead as we talk about George Bush.
Oh, hi. You've been discussing his patriotism in World War II, but there is another side to the story, which is that his father, Prescott Bush, had his assets seized under trading with the enemy with Nazi industrialists. And I'm also concerned about George Bush's history with the intelligence community, especially with the CIA. There's evidence of things that happened before he was CIA director, and also that Caspar Weinberger's notes revealed that he was not in fact out of the loop as he claimed, and as when he was made vice president, he put Manuel Noriega back on the CIA payroll. There have been a lot of this covered by the Consortium online investigative journal.
Bob Green.
Certainly the relationship between Bush and Noriega has been, as the caller suggests, online discussion for years. It is my understanding that it did happen exactly as the caller suggests, although much of that material to corroborate it exactly is still classified. The caller also talks about Iran-Contra and the in-the-loop concept. It's still a very, very tough call to find out exactly how in the loop A, George Bush was, and B, any vice president was in terms of the decision-making process involving any major foreign policy decision. The conclusion that I came to in my book is that George Bush was in the loop more than he said that he was, but less than his enemies said that he was. And that may be taken as a cop-out by many people listening, but it's really, given the documentation, the very best that historians can fairly do at this point.
Let's continue our discussion of George Bush's life a little bit in chronological order. We left him in Texas. Now we're in an area that talks about his first run for office. When did he first run?
He ran in 1964 for Congress out of the Houston district. I believe it was the 7th district at that time. And he was elected twice to serve in Congress. There are a lot of interesting photographs up in this section dealing with his congressional career. One of my favorites, though, is the one that was taken out at Andrews Air Force Base the day that Lyndon Johnson left office in 1969 after President Nixon was sworn in. And you can see Lyndon Johnson with his back to us, Lady Bird Johnson down at the bottom of the photograph, and you can see a young George Bush reaching out to shake hands with his fellow Texan, LBJ. I think this tells you a lot about George Bush and his feelings toward his fellow Texan. And I think this is an incident that the Bush and the Johnson families have never forgotten. And I must point out, too, that the original of this particular photograph is part of the audiovisual collection of the LBJ Library in Austin.
He had some thoughts of being in the Senate, Bob Green.
He had hoped to be in the Senate. He ran for the Senate and was defeated by Lloyd Bentsen. It was the next natural step up in the Republican Party ranks for him. But this picture that you point out, I think, is a very, very important one in terms of talking about George Bush's character. If one word describes George Bush's character, it's the word loyalty. And this, too, like most things, is a double-edged sword. Not only does it show, as the picture shows there, Bush's loyalty to a former president, or to a president of the United States and to a Texan, but it also, during the administration, manifested itself in Bush's inability or unwillingness to drop John Tower from the nomination as Secretary of Defense long after it was clear that the nomination was dead in the water. It may very well have hurt him in terms of keeping on people in his inner circle, like John Sununu when the Air Sununu scandal hit, and it may very well have hurt him in the Clarence Thomas hearings as well. Perhaps that nomination, it did hurt him politically. It hurt him politically badly, irregardless of Clarence Thomas's qualifications for the Supreme Court. Loyalty is something that is so ingrained in George Bush as it became part of his political fabric as well.
We're going to listen into a clip again from an interview that the former president gave to us just 3-4 weeks ago here in Texas, his reflections about losing races.
Move on to your Senate race. 2 times you ran for the Senate.
Ran and lost in 64, ran and lost in 70.
What do you remember about losing?
You mean just losing?
Just the whole experience, first of all.
Well, I hope this doesn't come out wrong. It's a character builder. I mean, I think I'm a better person because I've tasted defeat. Now I worked like the dickens to see that I wouldn't be defeated in 64, and then again in 70, and then again in 1992. It hurts a lot, but you learn to lose. You learn that there's a life beyond your own personal defeat. You learn that you got to be gracious in victory and defeat. You learn that the pain of losing is not yours alone. In my case, the pain of a lot of volunteers and staff people that helped me every inch of the way. There's so many lessons that you can get out of a defeat. But there's a lot of lessons you can learn in victory, too.
George Bush reflecting upon his failed bids for the Senate as he pursued his political career. David Alsterbrook and I are continuing our biographical look at George Bush as we make our way through the exhibits here at the George Bush Presidential Library. Next moves on to the head of the Republican Party.
This is when he was chairman of the Republican National Committee. This particular exhibit deals with that episode. One of the interesting documents in this case is on a yellow notepad the letter that he drafted to be sent to President Nixon, sadly telling him that he felt like the time had come for Mr. Nixon to step down as president. This is not George Bush's handwriting. This is the handwriting of Tom Lias, one of his aides who worked for him at the Republican National Committee. But this was the letter that President Bush, that then George Bush, dictated over the telephone for his aide.
Let's take a call from Cape Cod, and then we'll talk to Bob Green about this Watergate period in George Bush's life. Cape Cod, go ahead.
Hi, I just first wanted to congratulate Dr. Green as a Desert Storm veteran and someone that hails from Boston and the birthplace of President Bush in Milton. I had a trivial experience with Dr. Green back in 1984. I was a student at Cazenovia College, and I believe it's WITC, or it was at that time. I was called into an interview by Dr. Green to talk about Senator Kerry, but also Reagan and Bush back in '84. And my question is to Dr. Green, in your research, in your opinion, or in President Bush's opinion, the dichotomy of his generation versus his son's generation, and then the generation that he led as Commander-in-Chief, if he has any opinion, or if the President has any opinion in his research.
Thank you. It should be noted that Cazenovia College in central New York is Bob Green's home base.
And the radio station there is alive and well, and I remember the caller well, and I thank you. The dichotomy is something that is really on people's mind now with books like The Greatest Generation, Peter Jennings' book as well, that concentrates a lot on the World War II period. The qualities that are existent in the people who survived not just World War II but the Great Depression were shaping qualities for their character. But it should not be forgotten that the event that shaped the character of my generation, most importantly, was the Vietnam War. And people are still asking politicians of this generation to respond to their point of view during Vietnam. That was very important in terms of Dan Quayle's service, which is part of this particular program, certainly part of President Clinton's political background in terms of his resistance to the war, the draft dodging charges. The dichotomy that exists between the two is very important, and I would not be surprised if it does become a part of this political campaign sooner or later.
Seattle, Washington.
Hi. I have a comment and then a couple of quick questions. As I have talked with people about George W. Bush, one of the things that I see coming up again and again is this feeling from the American people that we somehow need to apologize or make up to his father for the defeat, and I'd like to hear your comments on that. And then also, how involved, if any, was George W. Bush in any of his father's White House activities, and how involved is George Bush in George W.'s campaign? And I'll hang up. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm not 100% certain because it's something that's been kept very close to the vest, the extent of former President Bush's involvement in George W.'s campaign. In terms of the issue of George W. in the Bush White House, George W. was kind of in and out of the Bush White House as a troubleshooter on several occasions. He was a minister without portfolio, in a sense. He was called in some personnel cases. The most important one that at least I believe the most important one was his role in coming in during the 1992 campaign to try to get it back on track during the early summer. In terms of Bush's, the link between the two right now, I think that really only time will tell whether that becomes an issue.
Could you, since we're still standing by the Watergate exhibit, could you talk to us a little bit about this period in George Bush's life? Why did he take the party post, and how difficult was it for him to tell President Nixon his own assessment of the state of his presidency?
Well, a lot of people, Susan, many people have a different point of view on this. The letter that David has shown you was a letter that went out to President Nixon and went to him, I believe, only 2 days before he resigned. And so some of the criticism of then GOP party chair Bush was that he didn't confide in the president earlier. The flip side of that is that the GOP party chair is not a position with cabinet rank. It's not a position with immediate access to the president. One of the things I found out from my earlier works on Nixon was how effectively Bush was closed out of the inner circle and how frustrated he was at not being able to get the access to President Nixon that he wanted to. It's not the most effectual performance of Bush's political career. It's not the most high profile either. But that letter that you are seeing does show that Bush did eventually make a break with the Nixon administration. That was important because it carried on into 1974 when, largely by some of the things that I saw at the Ford Library, on the face of that letter, Bush becomes a credible candidate for the vice presidency under Gerald Ford.
Let's take a call from Uniontown, Ohio.
Good evening. I have a question for Professor Green. I believe that after promising no new taxes, the tax increase plus the recession of the early 1990s hurt President Bush in the election of 1992. And while President Clinton takes credit for the current state of our economy, do you believe the roots of our current prosperity can be traced to President Bush's term in office? Thank you, and I'll hang up and listen to your answer.
Oh, absolutely. There's no economic crisis or there's no economic success that is endemic to any one particular presidency, and this was no exception. The caller does bring up the famous "Read My Lips" statement in the 1988 GOP National Convention. It was an ill-advised statement, there's no doubt about it. With the deficit that he inherited from Reagan, there was no way that Bush should have or could have made the promise that he did. There were several of his advisors. Dick Darman writes in his memoirs that he tried to talk him out of it, for example. But it was a Peggy Noonan line in the speech. And it was just one that would haunt Bush forever, because the minute that he comes into the presidency, he does see that he has to, and he does make moves to raise taxes. That may well, as some people have pointed out, been the root of what is being called the Clinton economic miracle, because it did stabilize the economy before the end of the Bush presidency.
But a speechwriter can't make a policy decision like that.
What a speechwriter did was it put the policy decision into a sound bite that people would remember. If George Bush had promised in that speech simply to raise taxes or to consider it, it might have been gone away in the middle of the campaign. But with people going around and Clinton saying, "Read my lips," and it was perfect for Ross Perot's campaign style, that phrase, ill-advised as it was in a way more devastating than the promise to raise taxes, which was at the root of it.
And borrowed from Clint Eastwood, wasn't it?
Read my lips. I think so. Yeah.
How about that little modern history worked into the Justice? David Alsterbrook and I are going to walk over to you, Bob Green. Now, people can start to put this whole thing together and see where you are and where we have been throughout this whole part. And we're going to say goodbye for just a bit, take a break, and when we come back, David Alsterbrook is going to continue our tour of the library while I stay here with Bob Green and answer more viewer telephone calls. During the break, we'll show you a speech that President Bush made that cements his connection with this school. It was his first foreign policy speech given on the campus of Texas A&M University, where we are right now, and we'll let you listen in, and we'll be back in 4 or 5 minutes.
The review of U.S.-Soviet relations that my administration has just completed outlines a new path toward resolving this struggle. Our goal is bold, more ambitious than any of my predecessors could have thought possible. Our review indicates that 40 years of perseverance have brought us a precious opportunity. And now it is time to move beyond containment to a new policy for the 1990s, one that recognizes the full scope of change taking place around the world and in the Soviet Union itself. In sum, the United States now has as its goal much more than simply containing Soviet expansionism. We seek the integration of the Soviet Union into the community of nations. And as the Soviet Union itself moves toward greater openness and democratization, as they meet the challenge of responsible international behavior, we will match their steps with steps of our own. Ultimately, our objective is to welcome the Soviet Union back into the world order.
Picture of the George Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, which houses the papers and collected memorabilia of the 41st President of the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush. We're here tonight learning more about the man who served as president for one term, 1989 through 1993, and our guest, John Robert Green, is the author of a brand new book, which I'd like to show you, The Presidency of George Bush. It's part of the University of Kansas American Presidency series, and we've been relying on a lot of these books throughout our 41 weeks looking at the presidents. David Alsobrook is also joining us tonight. He is the director of the George Bush Library and a number of members of his staff who have been helping us learn more about the life and times of this man. Let's pick up right where we left off, because we're beginning to get into this resume that is developing for George Bush. Was this a concerted effort on his part? Was he intending to put together a certain kind of preparation for the presidency?
Certainly not according to him. If you ask President Bush, and there is some evidence to bear this out, this was government service and duty as he strictly defined it. As you get closer on in terms of, actually earlier in his career, when you see the run for the Congress, the two runs for the Senate, one wonders when the presidential bug really bit him. But in terms of the intervening period, the period under Presidents Nixon and Ford, these were such terrible jobs that we're looking at. When you're looking at the head of the Republican Party during Watergate, liaison to China without really having a great deal of authority in terms of foreign policy, head of the United Nations under Henry Kissinger. I mean, these are jobs that one does not go out and seek normally if they're looking for political gratification. So in terms of duty, I certainly would find room to accept the president's explanation that I did this because the president asked me to, not to build a resume.
We hope you'll continue with your telephone calls, which help us know what interests you about each of these presidents. 202-624-1111 for those of you in the eastern half of the United States, and 202-624-1115 if you live west of the Mississippi. Next telephone call is from Springfield, New Jersey.
Hi, I'd like to know what do you think George Bush would be best remembered for?
The immediate answer is the Persian Gulf War. But I would like to think that Bush will be will go beyond that one event to be remembered for a wide array of domestic and foreign policy decisions. One of the things that happens to our most recent presidents is that we tend to kind of link into one thing. We tend to link into Watergate, or the Malaise speech, or the pardon, or Monica Lewinsky, and we concentrate on just that one area of the presidency. One of the things that I wanted to do in my work was to explore as many areas of the Bush presidency, domestic, foreign, military, economic, as possible. And it's quite possible that as more and more papers open up here at the library, that my answer on the Persian Gulf War, I think, is what it is today. It may not be 20 years from now. Certainly it's one of the greatest successes of his administration, but who knows what is upstairs in this marvelous archives that may change our point of view 20 years from now.
Mark Farkas is our producer tonight. He has also been the executive producer of our entire American President's Life Portrait series, and this is his very last biography tonight, so he's probably feeling a little bit nostalgic as we get toward the end of our 41-week project. His team includes Maura Pierce and Paul Brown, the other two producers who have been putting together this entire effort for you since March of this year. And also tonight directing, Brett Betzel, along with Gary Ellenwood, the two folks who have most often directed these programs for you and put all the pictures together so you can see the president's lives. Johnson City, Tennessee, you're next.
Yes, I had the honor of meeting President Bush once when he was on a campaign swing through eastern Tennessee. And in my short conversation with him, he mentioned that he could take me to a house in Kingsport, Tennessee, where his parents briefly lived. And I was just curious if you could give me any history in that regard.
No, I'm sorry, I can't. I did not know that President Bush's parents lived in Tennessee.
David Alsobrook, any Tennessee connections that you're aware of?
None that I can think of, Susan.
We'll have to have that remain a mystery unless our caller knows any more details. Let's move on to Hickory, North Carolina next.
Hi. I'd just like to, first of all, comment and commend you guys on the excellent job you're doing in this program. I'm a history teacher, and I've recommended your series to all of my students. My question deals with the politics surrounding the presidential election in 1992. With George Bush's admirable record as president, why do you suppose the fraction within the Republican Party, especially with Ross Perot, occurred at that particular time? And it seems like in recent years the Republicans, although they're doing very well in congressional elections, seem to be kind of shooting themselves in the foot with regard to the White House. I'll hang up and listen for your answer.
Thanks very much. In your book, you often make reference to things as laying the seeds for what would eventually happen in the 1992 election.
As you look at the year 1991, virtually every step that the administration takes, Susan, is alienating another part of the conservative wing of the Republican Party. With the decision, for example, to let go Governor Sununu as chief of staff, one of Sununu's chief jobs was to be the link between the conservatives and the moderate wing of the Republican Party. When he was gone, there was no link there.
Can I stop and just go back a little bit farther and ask what brought the conservatives to the Republicans? Were they traditionally a Republican base in American modern politics?
The conservatives had followed and kept with the Republican Party since 1945. But not with any great amount of satisfaction. They felt Eisenhower too moderate. They felt that Nixon had betrayed them in terms of the China leap and the link with Russia. They felt that Ford was completely out of touch with foreign policy. And so in 1976, you have a conservative challenge with Gerald Ford with Ronald Reagan. That laid the seed, and I overuse that phrase, but that laid the seed for the Reagan run in 1980. And the conservatives were disappointed with Ronald Reagan by the end of his presidency as well. There was grumblings about his raising taxes, for example, and there was great grumblings about his links to the Soviet Union. He went from the evil empire to meeting Mikhail Gorbachev in New York and in Helsinki. So by the time George Bush gets into office, the conservatives have essentially begun their split from the Republican Party. Bush does not take the steps that are necessary to keep the conservatives in his camp, and not just the loss of Sununu, but his appointment of Thomas, his read my lips, going back on the tax decision, was anathema to the Republican conservatives. He played right into Pat Buchanan's hands in 1992. There is a school of thought that suggests that the real person who beat George Bush in 1992 was not himself, not Bill Clinton, not Ross Perot, but Pat Buchanan, who mortally wounded him through a grueling primary series, made him spend more money than he needed to spend, had conservatives sit out the election. Keeping Dan Quayle did not help, did not hurt, and the conservative defection was a major reason for his defeat in 1992.
Sky Komish, Washington, next.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your program. I've watched each episode, and I've just been fascinated with the things that have been said and done. My question is for Dr. Green. It concerns George Bush in early 1981 when he was vice president, the assassination attempt on President Reagan. What did Mr. Bush do and not do during that time period of historical speaking?
What he didn't do was critically important, and he actually took a lead from Richard Nixon at this time. When Nixon was vice president under Dwight Eisenhower in the first heart attack, Nixon refused to sit in the president's chair in the cabinet meeting, even though he had the right to do so. Bush was in the air. I believe he was coming back or going from Texas at the time, and at the time of the assassination attempt, and when the plane is turned around, Bush writes a note to himself, which is on display here in the library, which says, you know, I've lost, he is a friend, he is a good man, he's mapping out what he's going to do when he gets back. When he gets to Washington, Bush refuses to have the Air Force chopper land on the south lawn of the White House, saying that only the president lands on the south lawn. And this was in perfect contrast to the rushed statement of Alexander Haig in the press room saying, I am in charge, which was not only a mangling of the American Constitution, but it was also just not good common sense at the time to give that air of panic. George Bush comes back and puts a sea of calm on the waters, and what this does in the long run, it's a very important part of his career. He had never been close to Ronald Reagan before this event. And he'd certainly not been close to Nancy Reagan. Nancy Reagan held him in very low esteem by all accounts. After this event is when Bush and Reagan got closer, the luncheon started, and this closeness, not only engendered by Bush's loyalty, but by Reagan's appreciation for what Bush had done during the time of his recuperation, built into a loyalty that not only was a personal one, but it helped Bush politically in 1988.
I need you to do this quickly because I've got a caller waiting, but I was also struck when you write about President Bush's inaugural speech, he distanced himself rhetorically.
Right. And that was the whole part of the first part of the Bush administration, was to distance himself from Reagan. And that was not taken kindly by the First Lady, who was apparently at the inaugural.
The former First Lady.
Former First Lady Nancy Reagan was so angry that somebody had to nudge her to keep from grimacing on the air at Bush. But that was politics as well.
Tulsa, you're next.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to make a comment about the book, and I also wanted to have a question regarding the museum. First of all, my wife and I are always looking for ways to teach my kids things, such as loyalty and kindness. And it's not really easy to do, but this book of letters really helps. We can explain the relationship between Barbara and George, and my kids understand that. They understand the nice notes and the romantic letters that he wrote Barbara. And my son understands how George struggled to land a plane on an aircraft carrier, and his eyes really light up. And also the losing of his daughter, George's daughter. I mean, my daughter and my son realize what it would be like to lose a sibling. So I guess my question for the museum is, are you ready for a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl?
David Alsobrook.
Absolutely. A lot of our visitors are young, very young, and we would certainly love to have your entire family come visit us.
Well, you're at the part of the exhibit that fits right in with that caller's question.
Exactly. have a number of portions of this exhibit in the permanent gallery that deal with Barbara Bush's interest and activities. They're scattered throughout the museum, but this is one corner which deals with her great interest in literacy of the American family. And you can see we actually have this area designed so that our visitors can come in and actually sit down on the sofa. Our younger visitors can pull books off the shelves and read those books. We also have some audio connections which allow our visitors to listen to some of Barbara Bush's story time episodes, which were on the radio back during the Bush administration. And so we can certainly have a lot to offer our younger visitors as well, and we hope the caller will bring the whole family here.
Monroe, New Hampshire.
Yes, calling because several years ago I had read an article that former President Nixon was extremely frustrated with President Bush when the Berlin Wall was coming down and communism seemed to be crumbling. And it was President Nixon's assertion privately, and then it came out publicly later, that because President Bush was such a loyal man, he may have been too loyal to Gorbachev, and he felt that President Bush should have paid more attention to Yeltsin. And while he may have been an unsavory character to a lot of people, especially the Washington crowd, that Nixon really felt that they should be making inroads towards Yeltsin because he was obviously the future and that Nixon could see that, but he didn't think that Bush could. And he tried to use intermediaries to get to Bush, but he couldn't get to him, so he had written a op-ed piece in the New York Times. And shortly thereafter, I believe that President Nixon had talked to Bush briefly about it. Do you have any thoughts on that at all as to what the relationship was between both of the presidents, and was there any efforts made to change policy toward the Soviet Union after Nixon had chatted with Bush at all in any way?
Well, it's my understanding that the relationship is exactly as the caller states it. Nixon had been treated by Bush up until the time of Watergate, certainly as a mentor, as a person who brought him through the ranks of the federal government. But Bush himself has said on several occasions that he became tremendously disenchanted and disappointed in Nixon's performance in Watergate and his obvious lying on the Watergate tapes, to the point where, as we saw a while back, he asked him to resign. And yet Nixon's reincarnation and rehabilitation in both the American eye and in his own eye made him a foreign policy presence. He had several trips to Russia during the period of the Soviet Union. He can certainly be treated as an expert in that regard, and he never blanched at giving the White House his advice, whether it was advice that was sought or not. And he did disagree, both publicly and privately, with Bush, but so did a lot of other people. There's room to consider the possibility that Bush did hang on to Gorbachev too long and did not make the outreach to Boris Yeltsin before it was a little bit too late to make political hay of it. Certainly Bush hanging on to Gorbachev and supporting him right down to the bitter end was one more story in terms of the conservatives abandoning him.
I want to come back to Barbara Bush. What kind of political partner was she for George Bush?
Well, I think she was a very close political partner and a personal advisor to President Bush. I don't think she was very public in this role, but I think she was very close to him throughout their lives.
I think that David's absolutely correct. One of the misconceptions about Barbara Bush, as I understand it, I haven't had the opportunity to meet her, is that she was soft and grandmotherly. Time ran a story on her, I think it was during the either the presidency or one of the earlier campaigns, and labeled her the Silver Fox. Very, very shrewd, very loyal to the family. I understand her to be very protective as well. But she also gave to the presidency an image, and I don't mean to suggest this in a calculated way, because all stories are that this is part of her fiber. David has talked to us about her commitment to literacy and the role that the Points of Light Foundation played in in this role. This is something that is very important to Barbara Bush, something that is very, very sincere, and her role here, as we can see with this picture, in terms of America's youth, it brings me back to her books and the books that were written by her dog Millie, and all of the proceeds were given to literacy foundations. In terms of a political partner, that opens up, of course, this whole different line of point of view.
That's Millie, the stuffed animal version of Millie. That's your mascot as you take the tour of the library here. That caller who was asking about bringing children here, Millie's one of the ways that you can take the tour, so she remains on. And not the first time, as we look back over the course of American history, that presidents have used dogs to their advantage. Lyndon Johnson and the Beagles.
Holding up the dog by the ears, Checkers speech. In fact, the interview that C-SPAN's Brian Lamb did just a few weeks ago with President Bush, I forget the dog's name, the Bush's new dog tromps onto the set and jumps up and licks the former president on the face.
Columbus, Ohio, you're next.
Yes, my question to Dr. Green is regarding the intervening period between where President Bush left the CIA as director and then won the vice presidential nomination with Governor Reagan. Mm-hmm. And also, if you could explain briefly the process of how he was selected by Governor Reagan, and I'll hang up and listen to your answer. Thank you.
It's my understanding of the situation that Bush essentially went back to Texas during this 2 or 3 year intervening period, worked through his major fundraisers, most notably Bob Mosbacher in Texas, to raise money for the upcoming campaign, was served on several boards of directors, I believe, and built his campaign team. In terms of the choice of Bush for vice president in 1980, it's a remarkable story in a lot of ways because, as I'm sure most of our listeners know, Bush was not Reagan's first choice. Gerald Ford was Reagan's first choice in 1980, the concept of a co-presidency. And it almost came to be until Ford sank the deal by going on television with Walter Cronkite and announcing it before Reagan was ready to have the deal announced, and Reagan then turned to George Bush. Bush was a very good choice for vice president as a candidate. Reagan was being seen as, and rightfully so at the time, as a conservative's conservative. It certainly was how Reagan wanted to paint himself. Bush had painted himself during the primary season as a moderate in contrast to Reagan, and he was able to run on that with some notable distancing himself from the abortion issue in 1980. Bush was able to run on that moderate tag, and I think that he helped Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election.
Since the time that President Eisenhower selected the camp in the Maryland mountainside as a place to escape from the pressures of the presidency, Camp David has played a role in presidential events and history-making times, and the public rarely gets to see it because it's such a private retreat. This is one of the presidential libraries where the former president has chosen to show us what it looks like. David Alsterbrook, what do we see here at this replica of Camp David?
Well, first of all, Susan, as your viewers know, most of the presidential libraries have replicas of the Oval Office. And several years ago, President Bush said, I would like our visitors at this museum to see where I had to make some of the most difficult choices of my presidency. And one of those places was his office at Camp David. And so near the end of the administration, I think it was the next to last weekend that he was still in Washington, several of us went out to Camp David. We photographed everything inside the office. We took a lot of B-roll video so that we could recreate the office. And then we began to meticulously box up and label every single object that was in the Camp David office so that we could put this office back together as you see it here today. So virtually everything in there, with the exception of some of the pieces of furniture that the Navy, of course, would not let us take, that has to stay in the permanent Camp David office. Virtually everything in that office, including the model of the Finback, the submarine that that picked him up after he was shot down, everything in there is original. You can also see on the floor to the right there the dog treat dispenser, so that when Millie and Ranger were out there, they would have something to snack on. President Bush once said that the dogs did a very good job of teaching all the human beings around them how to pull that lever so that the food would come out for them. But this was it's a very small, warm, comfortable place that President Bush truly loved when he was president, and this, I think, reflects the man. You can see the models of ships, you can see photographs of ships at sea, you can see some of the medals that he won while he was in naval service and also as director of the CIA. You can see the line drawn in the sand to the left here. This was a photograph that I believe David Frost had presented to him, symbolic of the Gulf War. But to recreate the Camp David office was definitely President Bush's decision, and I think that tells you an awful lot about his deep interest in this library and museum.
I'm going to ask our cameras to stay there. I have a couple questions, but let's take some calls. San Diego, you're next.
Thank you. I appreciate C-SPAN's in-depth history of our presidency series, and I want to commend this group too. And Mr. Alsobrook, do we know if Mrs. Bush and her daughter were educated in certain politics, as well as the other two sons that we don't know about, that are not currently known about in politics?
Well, I think, Susan, I can probably best respond to that question by saying that that the entire Bush family, you know, they all have personal lives, and this is part of their private lives that I'm sure will not be well publicized. But I think it's pretty common knowledge just from reading the newspaper that some of the Bush boys are much more interested in politics than others, and I think those two are both serving as governors of Texas and Florida respectively. Now, this is not to say that Neil and Marvin Bush aren't interested in politics. I just don't think they're quite as public in terms of their interest in politics. But this is part of the private life of any former First Family, and I think most Americans respect the fact that even former presidents and former First Ladies have private lives, and allow them to pursue those private lives.
Dr. Green, Neil Bush, I believe it was, had a bit of a brush with the whole savings and loan investigation.
He did, and that became a bit of a political problem. He was, I believe, exonerated from that. This played into the entire savings and loan crisis of the 1980s. I believe you're referring to the Silverado Bank incident, and it was one of the many banks that was failing during the period. David's answer, though, brings up, and the question brings up, you know, our desire to know what families are doing and what the relations of our political people are doing, and their equal and opposing desire to keep it as private as possible. Neil and Marvin and Dora have been out of the public eye now and have essentially escaped much press attention, while their two other brothers, Jeb, the governor of Florida, and George W., quite rightfully so, have been the subject of media attention. There has to be, I think, a line, and nobody's found this line yet, and I'm not sure that the press will in my lifetime find the line over which you can't step in terms of looking into someone's private life.
Carmel, California.
Susan, thank you so much for this series, and tonight even just a little peek into Camp David's neat treat. Just wanted to ask Professor Green, a lot of us feel that we would have been spared the trauma of the Clinton presidency if Ross Perot was not in the '92 election, since a lot of disaffected Republicans voted for him. In your research, did you come across what it was between these two men that caused such animosity on Perot's part in his subsequent run for the presidency?
One of the things that several of Ross Perot's biographers, Gerald Posner being one of them, has speculated is that there was a deep-seated animosity between Bush and Perot. even before the campaign. You see here the famous second debate where Bush is looking at his watch at that point in time. And many people feel that during that campaign and during the spirited presentation from both Clinton and Perot, Bush kind of lost his cool and essentially looked like he wished that the debate was over. And that plays right into the caller's question, because certainly Ross Perot was a thorn in Bush's side all the way through the campaign. Perot's unpredictability made it difficult for both campaigns, the Clinton and the Bush campaign, to know which way to turn next. In terms of Perot, I wouldn't pretend to understand Ross Perot's desire to enter into the political fray. I'm not an expert in that. I didn't have the opportunity, although it was availed to him, to interview Mr. Perot. I would suggest, however, that the statistics show that Perot took votes from both sides, not equally. The caller's correct that he took more votes from Bush than from Clinton, but not by very much. Perot is not the deep-seated reason that lost. Had he been out of that campaign, I would submit to you, because of the problems inherent in the campaign himself and in Bush as a candidate, Bush would have still lost that election.
Let's return to the Camp David and look at the bookshelves. And I want to ask you a question about George Bush's intellectual interests. Okay. Was he a reader? Was he a continual student while he was in the White House?
All indications are, Susan, that he did read quite widely. One of the things that it's interesting that these books, mostly military, which is and historical novels. We see Larry McMurtry there. We saw the multi-volume set of George Marshall down in the shelf below. These are the books of Bush's passion, but it's difficult to judge by these bookshelves. Many of them were gifts, I imagine, from people. I think, however, it does, and maybe David would want to chime in on this, give an indication of Bush's reading interest. It's not just pulp history, but he does enjoy the historical narrative. I was interested in taking a look not just at the bookshelf there, but at the books that I saw on the shelves of his office in Houston when I interviewed him there, which were remarkably like this. The other thing, of course, that needs to be said is that when you talk about the intellectual grit of the president, this is a man who graduated from Yale, no mean trick then or now. It is a man who, but it's also a man who has one of the most time-consuming, I'm not certain I want to say the most difficult job in the world, but most time-consuming job in the world. And I can just barely find time to read a book, and I'm not sure that he should be judged on that criteria.
Mr. Alsterbrook, are those books exactly in the order that you found them at Camp David and reflect his taste?
Yes, I think if you wanted to, you could describe George Bush as an eclectic reader, you know, who likes fiction and nonfiction. I think during the '92 campaign, I believe he was reading David McCullough's Harry Truman biography. I mean, he's widely read, and these are the books that we actually took out of the Camp David office. These aren't some books that came out of the gift collection that were boxed up upstairs. These are actually the books that were on the shelf at Camp David, and I might add that there was another large bookshelf that was where the railing in front of the exhibit now stands. There was also a large bookshelf there that was filled with books as well. So I think the fact that these books came from Camp David, a place that he loved to spend time at and reflect and visit so frequently, that I think these books are probably a pretty good representation of the type of reading that he did. Now, over the years, we've compiled various lists that the White House put out of his favorite books over the years, and we've got several lists of those available in our research room, but this is I think this is a pretty good representation of the type of reading that he liked to do. You know, like Bob Greene said, you've got a lot of history up there, you've got a lot of military history, but you've got a lot of things about sports and the outdoor life, and a lot of novels by Texas authors as well.
In case you've ever wondered, it's about a 90-minute drive from the Washington, D.C. downtown to Camp David, Maryland. That depends on the traffic, of course, but and most presidents travel by helicopter to get there these days. Spring Hill, Louisiana, next.
Good evening, Susan. I've enjoyed this series immensely. I haven't heard a great deal said about the President's Supreme Court appointments. I am a conservative, retired from the military, and I think that President Bush should be remembered for two specific things. One, in the Gulf War, he allowed the military to run the operation. And secondly, his Supreme Court appointment of Clarence Thomas, in my mind, was a stroke of genius. I have listened to that gentleman every opportunity, particularly on C-SPAN and the judicial series that you have. And
Thanks.
He has impressed me as one of the most brilliant men in our nation today.
Thanks.
Thank you, and I'll hang up and await your response.
All right, we'll let you listen to a clip from the appointment of Clarence Thomas and then come back and talk about that process.
Well, I am very pleased to announce that I will nominate Judge Clarence Thomas to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I have followed this man's career for some time, and he has excelled in everything that he has attempted. He is a delightful and warm, intelligent person who has great empathy and a wonderful sense of humor. He's also a fiercely independent thinker with an excellent legal mind who believes passionately in equal opportunity for all Americans. He will approach the cases that come before the court with a commitment to deciding them fairly, as the facts and the law require. Judge Thomas's life is a model for all Americans, and he's earned the right to sit on this nation's highest court, and I am very proud indeed to nominate him for this position, and I trust that the Senate will confirm this able man promptly.
Well, we'll talk about the Senate's confirmation process, but we have another caller with a question on Clarence Thomas. Let's listen into that from Springfield, New Jersey.
Hi, my name is Roman. I was wondering what kind of interests or hobbies besides politics he had while growing up and during his free time as president.
Well, thanks. That wasn't a question on Clarence Thomas, so let's come back to Supreme Court and we'll get to your question on interests and hobbies growing up a little later on. How many Supreme Court appointments did George Bush get to make during his 4 years?
He was able to make two. He nominated and had confirmed David Souter as his first appointment, and Justice Clarence Thomas of the District Court in Washington was his second appointment, and by far the more problematic.
What happened?
What didn't happen? This was one of the most contentious nomination hearings for the Supreme Court in American history. It was smooth sailing through the first round of hearings. In fact, I believe that the Senate Judiciary Committee voted split even as a tie on the nomination itself, but voted to send it out to the floor where the president assumed that it would win. And then in the intervening period between when it was voted out of committee, the Anita Hill story broke. A law professor from Oklahoma accused Judge Thomas of sexual harassment and of dabbling in pornography and many other things of a very personal nature. When we talked earlier about Bush's loyalty, one questions the decision, has to question the political decision to hang on to Clarence Thomas. The previous caller, actually 2 callers ago, gave the opinion that Judge Thomas has been a good justice. I'm not prepared to dispute that. I'm not prepared to deal with it in any way, except to suggest that at the point in time in those hearings, Justice Thomas's qualification as a judge ceased to matter. It became a cause célèbre in terms of sexual harassment. It became one of the lowest moments in the Senate's history, with Mr. Hatch, who's now running for president, holding up a copy, I believe, of The Exorcist, saying that this was where some of this material came from, making comments on the Senate floor about Senator Kennedy and Chappaquiddick Bridge. It was a brouhaha on the floor. And Justice Thomas comes back to the committee after the hearings and he says, look, either put it up or put it down, one way or the other, but let's get this over with. And he calls it, I believe, in using his words, a witch hunt. It was just an absolute mess, and it cost Bush, interestingly enough, Susan, it cost him huge numbers in support of African Americans. His numbers had been very, very high there up to that point. It did not help him one iota. The conservatives abandoned him, and whether or not Justice Thomas is a good judge just didn't matter during that period.
Houston, you're next on George Bush.
Hi, this is Steve Magliaro, and we're so proud to have the President and Mrs. Bush living here in Houston. And my question to Mr. Green was, I wonder if you were to go back to Camp David for one moment, if you're familiar with the history of Camp David and how presidents started coming up there, because I was a salesman at Capital Cadillac for a few years in the 90s, and I was told that a man named Floyd Akers, who had a retreat up there, brought President Eisenhower up one winter, and he loved it so much he named it after his grandson David, and ever since then the presidents have been going up there. Is that a true story?
I know that it was named after. I know that it was named after his grandson, David, and I think the previous name of it was Shangri-La, if I'm not mistaken. Whether or not Eisenhower was the first, I'm really not sure. Susan's shaking her head yes, so I think you know.
Because we did that installment of the President series and learned about Camp David. David Alsobrook, because of your association with the National Archives, can you tell us any more about Camp David's history?
Yeah, and I think Bob's exactly right. It was originally named Shangri-La. It was built by the Navy, I believe, and I think they may have had some CCC people involved in it during the 30s, but it was built and first used by FDR. At least that's my understanding.
And the name was changed by President Eisenhower?
Yes, it was originally Shangri-La.
During FDR's time, and then when Eisenhower came there and named it after his grandson.
Correct.
That's how it worked. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. Well, we are going to continue taking your telephone calls and seeing more of the library. The next, we're going to ask David Alsobrook to take us to the area that shows some of the gifts that President Bush received during his years in the White House. Can you walk over there and talk to us a little bit about what you've got on display?
Well, I sure can, Susan. This is the Gifts of State section of the library. My museum curator is Patricia Birchfield, and one of her jobs is to make sure that all these gifts are cataloged. We finished cataloging the foreign head of state gifts, I guess, a couple of years ago. So this is just a representative sample of some of the types of foreign gifts that an American president receives. And we will rotate these gifts from time to time in order to preserve them and also to make sure that we have a good sample of gifts from all over the world.
What's the process or law regarding gifts from heads of state?
Well, normally all head of state gifts are property of the American people. In other words, anything that a president or a vice president receives in the course of his or her official duties in terms of gifts from a head of state are automatically the property of the American people, and they usually are deposited in a presidential library and museum as they are here.
Can you pick one from what you've got on display there that people really seem to be intrigued by?
Well, you know, that's I realize that's a real favorite of C-SPAN. You always want to know what our favorite is. And that's a real hard one to respond to, but I'll tell you one that's very touching for a lot of our visitors, and that's this clock, this small carriage clock, which was presented to him by Lady Diana.
You've picked up on our favorite questions. You've been watching too often. Well, speaking of gifts, you not only receive gifts from heads of state as president, but also from the American public. Next, we're going to introduce you to Patricia Birchfield, who is on the 3rd floor of this building to show us how one catalogs and records American history through the eyes of the American public. What do you have for us there?
Oh, good evening. I'm on the 3rd floor of the library, and I have a selection of American gifts from the American people. This is a boot that was given from Rocky Carroll, who made this cowboy boot and was presented to President Bush. You can see that we have several things from all over the country. This is a wooden sculpture from New Jersey, and a little airplane sculpture from North Carolina. The chair that we're looking at over here is from Washington, D.C. The gifts from the American people are whimsical, they're witty, they're imaginative. They're made of all kinds of material. You can see the front of a Wheaties box that is from General Mills in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Patricia Birchfield, how many gifts all told does the library have here?
We have 70,000 gifts in this room.
70,000, and is each one of them cataloged?
We're cataloging them as fast as we can. We have about 30 volunteers that assist us with this cataloging project and 2 full-time people. That's all they do is catalog artifacts.
From among those you have had a chance to look at, which is, for want of a better word, the wackiest that you've seen?
The wackiest gift from the American people is probably a decorated pine cone.
A decorated pine cone. And what's it depicting?
It's depicting a bird.
And what's the connection with the presidency?
It's just a gift from the American people. It's just one of those whimsical things.
What do people, why do people give presidents gifts, do you think?
I think that there's a relationship between the American people and their presidency. And this is a tradition that has begun with the very first president, with George Washington. The painting was given to President Washington of a set of twins that were named Martha and George in 1789.
Let's go in close, if we can, on that blue bag right in front of you so we can see some of the detail and the work that people have put into this. And as we do that, we'll take a telephone call from Baltimore.
Hi, how are you doing?
Thanks for your call.
Thank you so much for the presidential programs. I've enjoyed them very much, particularly those about the 19th century presidents. One thing that I was curious about as you got closer to the presidents that we actually remember and were alive during was how historians would talk about them. And this was an interesting thing your historian mentioned just a few minutes ago when asked about how Ronald Reagan selected George Bush as his vice president. The story was, and was widely reported in the press at the time, is that the co-presidency thing with Gerald Ford fell through when Mr. Ford had his famous interview with Walter Cronkite at the time. However, what was interesting to me is that in Brian Lamb's interview with Gerald Ford, which was shown as part of your Gerald Ford programs, you specifically talked to Mr. Ford about that, and Mr. Ford categorically denied that that was the case, that the whole talks about the co-presidency had broken down before he had even begun to speak with Mr. Cronkite. And so I was wondering what sources the historian was using, and how does a historian deal with that sort of situation where there's someone alive and involved in the situation who doesn't necessarily agree with the accepted story?
You've essentially asked me to explain my job. And what it entails is to interview the former president. I had the opportunity to talk with President Ford about this event, to talk to other people who were around the event, to talk to other people who observed it, to look at documentation, to look at available archival evidence, to look at the press record, particularly important for the modern presidents, shouldn't be ignored out of spite or a belief in a liberal bias, and to come to a conclusion based on the balance of the evidence, which I did. And I would stand by the statement that it had indeed that it was right up until the time of the interview, the nomination was still in play.
Let's return to Patricia Birchfield on the third floor of the library, and let's look at a couple of other gifts that the President and First Lady received, and maybe we can show them in a little, as close as we can, so people can see what kind of work is involved.
Well, Susan, this is one other kind of gift in our collection. The President and Mrs. Bush have also given us things out of their personal collection, and this is one of the purses that Mrs. Bush needlepointed during the 1960s campaign when she started learning needlepoint and would go on campaign lectures and campaign speeches with George Bush during his many campaigns, and she would needlepoint as she listened to the speech.
With the GOP elephant.
That's right.
And what's right in front of it? You've got some medallions or buttons?
Yes, we also, the presidential museums continue collecting once we get into the presidential library. We're trying to have the largest collection of George Bush campaign memorabilia in the United States. And we are assisted quite a bit by donors who are giving us their collections of President Bush's campaign collections.
So if anyone's watching tonight who has buttons, early George Bush campaign buttons and the like, are you interested in talking to them?
Absolutely, absolutely.
How do they find you?
They can give us a call at 409-260-9552.
Thank you. As you dig your way through 70,000 gift items to President and Mrs. Bush, thank you for showing us some of them tonight.
Thank you.
Let's return to telephone calls on the life and times of our 41st President, George Bush. Oxford, Mississippi, next.
Yes, this question's for Professor Green, and it goes back to the legacy and what we thought his legacy would be. And while the breaking of the no new taxes pledge hurt him politically, isn't it true that or isn't it true that he bargained for a stop in the growth of entitlement programs, the automatic growth in entitlement programs, in exchange for the additional taxes, and that has helped or stopped the deficit spending that the government had or that they were involved in at that time?
It was certainly a part of the tax package. And the Bush people were always at wit's end to try and find a way to get the press to pick up on that part of the story. But of course what the press was picking up on, and so were the American people, was the fact that taxes had been raised. The caller brings up a part of the story that was talked about a little while ago in terms of President Clinton inheriting a reasonable, or at least a repaired economic system. The cutting in entitlements certainly led to that. The caller does, however, use a troublesome word for a historian, and that's the word legacy. And a legacy is, by its very nature, a judgment. And it's difficult to judge any individual whom we are so close to and whom we really have a limited amount of documentation, not small, but a limited amount of documentation. And when you look at the final statement on the Bush presidency, it's going to be changing literally by the year. Maybe it will be no new taxes.
We've been hearing a lot about the read my lips statement. Let's listen to it.
My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into. And my opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no. And they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
And what kind of Congress was he talking about? What was the makeup that he had to deal with as president?
He was talking at the time about a Congress that was going to be controlled by the Democratic Party, and he knew that. That was a given in the 1988 election, no matter what happened to his candidacy. He was, and many people have missed this, and I'm really glad you brought this up, read my lips was a declaration to the Congress, and saying that when you bring me higher taxes, when you try to budget or balance the budget that way, I'm going to turn it down. He inherited a gaping deficit from Ronald Reagan. We can judge Reagan's legacy fairly now. One part of it has to be the huge budget deficit that Bush had to deal with. And I've said it earlier in this program, I think that it was ill-advised to suggest that that could be done without a tax hike, but he did it so beautifully there. He pounded the words. If there are people who have suggested, and I fall into this category, that if he could have shown that fire in 1992, things might have been different. I mean, he handled that crowd beautifully. It was almost Reagan-esque in its delivery.
Back to the Congress, what kind of numbers did he have? What kind of leads did the Democrats have in both the House and the Senate?
I don't remember the specific numbers, but they were enough so that at one point in time it was veto-proof.
which gave him what kind of ability to put through a program of his own?
Virtually none. When you look at the domestic politics of the period, when you look at his attempt to try to get through the kind of anti-drug package that he wanted, to try to get through the civil rights acts that he wanted to get through. One of the criticisms of the Bush administration by scholars is that he had no domestic policy. I don't fall into that. He had a domestic policy, but it was impossible to pass. And as a result, that domestic policy became very muted, almost in the backdrop of the foreign policy successes of the administration. It's difficult to put your finger on any specific area, with the possible exception of the aid that was given to the handicapped.
Do you know how many vetoes he issued during his 4 years?
Off the top of my head, no.
Approximately. You said you used the veto as one way to get his way with Congress.
Well, I don't remember the specific number, but there was a strategy in the Bush administration, Susan. The only way that he really could deal with the Congress on domestic policy was to keep sending the bill back to them and go back into negotiation so that the Congress would give him back a bill that he could live with. One of the things that we find with Bush's vetoes, and there's a list of them that you see there in the library, is that it took right through until the 4th year before he was overridden on a veto. And that's a very important part. He was able to play this veto strategy very well, even though at one point in time the numbers should have made, you know, the House veto proof.
Live from the George Bush Presidential Library in College Station, Texas, and you're getting a special tour tonight from David Alsobrook, who is the director of the library, and he's going to make his way inside to the exhibit that details the Persian Gulf War. As he does, we'll listen to Columbus, Ohio.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to ask Professor Green a question. Author Teddy White, in his book Selling of a President, stated that TV captures the character of a man. Now, George Bush, on a one-to-one interview since his presidency, comes across very engagingly, but on the campaign stump, candidate Bush came across very rigidly, which makes the candidate appear to be less than honest. On the other hand, opponent Bill Clinton appeared charming on the campaign trail, and this may create a question as to Teddy White's theory that television always catches the true character of a man. And obviously, Mr. Clinton's character is not the same as Mr. Bush. What do you think of television, and does television sometime not capture the true essence of a candidate?
Throughout his series, The Making of the President, the 4 books that he wrote in a 5th sequel, Theodore White was observing a media that was completely different from the media today. It was less intrusive, and it was really less prone to intervening in a president's personal life. But one thing that I think needs to be highlighted is that what scholars call the public presidency, the ability of the president to engage the American people in a way that they understand, better known, I think, as the vision thing, George Bush was severely wanting. He was never able to pull off in public what Ronald Reagan was able to pull off with the same type of grace. In Bush's eyes, it was because the actions speak louder than words, that the American public would look at what he accomplished, put it up against the more shallow record of a Ross Perot or of a Bill Clinton, even though he had been governor of a state, and would eventually give Bush the reward that he was due. That is not the way that politics works. It's certainly not the way that politics worked in 1988, when Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes made absolutely certain that Bush's public persona was exactly the way that they wanted it portrayed. In 1992, the public presidency, and Bush is not the most graceful of public speakers, although he has had his moments at the 1988 convention and in the speech that he made at the end of the Persian Gulf War. Bush's inability to link with the public came back to haunt him.
Was Lee Atwater the first architect of the personal attack in politics, the modern campaigns that we talk about so much now?
No, but he was one of the best. There have been attack dogs under every single president. And Lee Atwater was skilled in using personal politics and attack politics in a way that hadn't been used before. Bush lost sorely when he lost Atwater. And
how could a person whom you've described as being nice and someone we've seen with so many family-oriented characteristics and a nice guy writing letters be comfortable with a campaign advisor like Lee Atwater?
Because George Bush was a good politician, and he knew in 1988, and so did his close personal advisors, that for him to be able to stay in the public mind as quote-unquote a nice guy, he needed someone who was going to be able to do the type of politics that George Bush needed to have done. It was a complementary type of thing, Susan. It was something where he got someone who filled in gaps for him.
Springfield, New Jersey.
Hi, my name is Ziad Shahadi. I was wondering, how did Bush deal with the attempted assassination of President Reagan in 1981?
Thanks. We've had that question earlier, so very brief response.
Very brief is that he dealt with it very well. He did not bully his way into the Oval Office. He did not try to be an acting president. Indeed, he handled it well enough so that it vastly improved his relationship with Ronald Reagan.
Landover Hills, Maryland.
Good evening, Susan. Nice show as usual. I was wondering whether they have memorabilia about, all the comedians that were following the president, during his presidency. The one that sticks to mind is Dana Carvey, especially. Has the president, made up, with all these comedians? That's my question.
The president seemed to enjoy, for some reason, I'm certain that I wouldn't if someone was parodying me, Dana Carvey's I must say, dead-on impersonation of the president. He invited Carvey there in the last weeks of the presidency, and they seemed to want to outdo each other being the best George Bush. During the campaign trail, Bush has a very wry sense of humor. During the campaign, I think it was in 1988, he put on a George Bush mask and went back and forth in the airplane shouting, "Read my lips, read my lips." There are going to be comic impersonators who are going to be the new telepolitical cartoonists, if you will, and the president just has to simply learn to live with them. And Dana Carvey was interesting because he highlighted part of Bush's personality, which was the not going to do it, wouldn't be prudent, that played into a lot of people's stereotype of George Bush as being a little bit too cautious and a little bit too prudent, and that maybe that hammering home did catch on, because Carvey was a regular with this every single Saturday night during the 1992 campaign.
Mr. Alsobrook, Library Director, give us some key points of the Persian Gulf exhibit here at the George Bush Library.
Well, Susan, first of all, it would be very easy to spend, about 90 minutes in the Gulf War exhibit by itself. We've had a number of Gulf War veterans who have gone through here and have told us that we've gotten it pretty close to the mark. Of course, only the veterans will ever know for sure exactly what it was like. The first part of this portion of the exhibit deals with the diplomacy and the attempts to try to work things out diplomatically. In one part of this exhibit, we actually use an hourglass to symbolize the fact that the sands were running out. I think one of the most poignant parts of this exhibit, though, is the letter that George Bush wrote to his kids on New Year's Eve, 1990, in which he agonized over the fact that as Commander-in-Chief, he was going to have to commit young American men and women to combat. And in the White House, they referred to these as self-typed letters because he typed it himself, and you can see that with this letter, he made his own handwritten corrections as well. But I mean, you can tell that he put a lot of emotion into this letter, and it so happens that of everything that's in our museum here, this is one of the things that's most requested by our visitors in terms of getting a copy of it. And so we do make copies available of this letter. But as President Bush indicated to me when he was in here last week, he said now that his book, All the Best, is out, that letter is reproduced in the book, so our visitors can certainly get a copy of the letter that way as well.
8 minutes left in our exploration of the George Bush presidency. Delicate question for you. Did the Bushes, David Alsobrook, in their plans for this library also make their decisions about their final resting places?
Susan, that particular question, that's not really my area of expertise. Normally, those questions are handled by the Bush's personal attorneys, their chief of staff, and that sort of thing. But in this particular case, since this has already been made public through the newspaper here in Texas and all across the country, excuse me, their decision is to be laid to rest here on the grounds of the library.
And we have on videotape the part of the library grounds which has been designated as the burial plots for George and Barbara Bush. And also, Robin, is that what you told me earlier, Dr. Green?
I believe so.
Robin is the young child of the Bush who died of leukemia at a very early age.
I think that was part of the press story that David is referring to.
Let's take another telephone call. St. Paul, Minnesota.
Hi, I have a question for your guest, Professor Green. You were mentioning earlier about the legacy that President Reagan left President Bush, that being the deficit. Why did President Bush feel the need to abandon that legacy, given the fact that while President Reagan cut taxes, he doubled the revenues that came into the government? And I was wondering why President Bush didn't go ahead and cut taxes again to grow our way out of the deficit instead of raising taxes, which I think ultimately cost him the election.
Well, part of Ronald Reagan's legacy was also the raising of taxes. He did raise specific taxes. He had a specific word for them that he hoped people wouldn't catch on to too quick. There wasn't exactly a tax. I think it was a revenue enhancement. But Reagan did indeed raise taxes towards the end, but it was not enough to get the nation out of the tremendous economic spiral that it had been in. I think that it is a myth that Ronald Reagan bequeathed to George Bush a stable economy. In terms of why George Bush decided not to raise taxes, decided to reverse himself, the answer to that is fairly simple. That couldn't be done and balance the budget. It was the only political option that was open to him was to raise revenue by way of taxes. He virtually had no choice in the matter.
What were the election results in 1992?
George Bush ran against Ross Perot, the Reform Party candidate, and Democrat Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, as you can see by the numbers there, pulled in a sizable victory over a three-man field. The part of the story, of course, is Ross Perot's almost 20 million votes. It was not a mandate for Bill Clinton. He did not get 50% of the vote, but it was by no means a close election either.
And George and Barbara Bush retired to private life, coming back to Houston, Texas. And Houston is the place where we talked to the president last month. Here's what he had to say about advice to his sons.
Your son is in front of you, and you got 2 minutes to tell him some broad, basic approaches to running for president based on what you've already experienced. What do you tell him?
You're talking about my oldest son or all my boys?
George W. Any of them. Anyone run
I give them all the same advice. Be yourself. Be honest. Respect others. And do your best. And if you win or lose, your life's going to be fantastic ahead of you. I would definitely tell them that, because that's what's happened in my life. And I can speak from considerable experience. And I'd tell them, give it your best shot, and I'll be there to help you if you get hurt.
Bob Green, what kind of former president has George Bush chosen to be?
He's chosen to be, from my point of view, Susan, a teacher. He is a very integral part of this library. As David was saying a while back, he shows up here a great deal, shows up and participates in meetings at the Bush School next door. He has chosen to immerse himself in here and in the atmosphere at Texas A&M.
Our last call comes from Stockton, California.
Hello. Regarding the 1992 campaign, did Bush initiate the mean-spiritedness of this campaign against Clinton, and if so, why? Thank you very much.
I'm not sure that I would characterize the campaign in terms of mean-spirited. In fact, there are others who feel that it should have been a little more mean-spirited in terms of calling Clinton out on specific issues. The 1988 campaign certainly was mean-spirited. Bush does rail at Clinton and Gore personally by the end of the campaign. That was more fatigue than anything else. If there had been a little bit more combativeness, who knows, the tide might have turned. But the mean-spiritedness, from what I see with that particular campaign, worked from three directions, both from the Bush campaign as well as the Clinton and the Perot.
Let's close where we began. David Alsterbrook at the end of the exhibit here. If people are interested, how can they visit you?
I assume you mean in person, right, Susan?
That's right.
Okay, well, you
How many hours are you open? What days of the week?
Okay,
all that sort of thing.
Okay, the only days we're closed are Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. We are open from 9:30 until 5, Monday through Saturday, and then on Sundays from 12 until 5.
And right over your shoulder is what, as you're talking to us?
Right over my shoulder is Fidelity One. This was President Bush's first boat that he loved so much, which was at Kennebunkport. And several years ago, he asked me one day if we wanted the boat, and we said, yes, sir, we do. And about a year ago, we took that side of the wall out of the museum that's right next to the boat, and we moved the Fidelity in here, and that's where she'll stay forever.
Well, thanks for allowing us to move in here for a few days to be able to show people the George Bush Presidential Library here in College Station, Texas, and thanks to your staff and yourself for all the help you've given us tonight.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thank you for everything that C-SPAN has done in terms of taking the presidential libraries out to the American people. Thank you.
And in closing, let me show once again John Robert Green. We've been calling him Bob Green all night tonight. His brand new book, The Presidency of George Bush. One of many books that you can read. This is the newest edition on a presidency that's just over by about 6 years or 7 years or so, and a difficult job putting all the pieces together. We thank him for being here tonight to give us his view of the presidency of George Bush.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
And finally, thanks to Cox Communications. They are our affiliate here. Bring Cox to this community, bring C-SPAN rather to this community, and a longtime supporter of C-SPAN. Our thanks to them for their help in pulling together this program tonight. As we close, we'll tell you that our final installment, the 42nd President of the United States, Bill Clinton, will be live from Hope, Arkansas, his birthplace, on the 20th of December. We hope you'll be with us then. You have a good rest of the night.